discussion session for History Paper 2, November 2023. So I'm going to deal with source-based questions. So in source-based questions, you have civil resistance, the coming of democracy to South Africa, and the coming to terms with the past. Then we also have the end of the Cold War and a new world order from 1989 to present. So we are going to be using the sources. So in this case, for question 1D, we do have source 1A rather. The first source is actually source 1A. It is an article published in the Namibian newspaper on the 6th of December, that is in 1985. It explains the event unfolding during the conference launch of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, which is also known as KATU. It also describes KATU's role as a labor movement. So going back to the question paper, we look at the first question. All right, the first question, it actually reads study source A. We assume that you would have studied source A, you would read the source before you attempt any questions. So the first question would read, why, according to the source, did the newly launched KATU threaten to call for a national strike? So if we refer back to our source, that is in paragraph number 1, you would actually go to line number 6. So let's go to line number 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we'll start it with from here. So I'm going to highlight where we take our answer from. I'm going to highlight where we are going to take our answer from. So it starts by saying leaders of the new super federation have already threatened to call for a national strike. If the government carries out its threat to repatriate or to send back migrant workers, and have pledged to organize workers in their homelands in defiance of any restrictions on unions in these regions. So the correct answer there will be to oppose repatriation or the sending back of migrant workers. So that's where we are going to take our answer from. So I'm going to write the answer right here, the suggested answer. So KATU intended to oppose repatriation. So say to oppose repatriation of migrant workers. So they wanted to oppose repatriation, or what I've explained is the sending back of migrant workers. They intended to oppose that. So that's why they decided to threaten to call for a national strike. Now moving on to 1.1.2. Explain why you think KATU supported the campaign for disinvestment against the apartheid government in South Africa. Remember, KATU was actually fighting against apartheid policies. So one of the methods which they used, they actually campaigned for disinvestment in South Africa. So you can actually say that KATU wanted to force democratic reforms in South Africa. You can say KATU wanted to force the government end apartheid. They wanted to force the government to end the racial policy of apartheid. So one of the methods which they used, they actually used disinvestments rather. They actually campaigned for disinvestment in South Africa. Disinvestment is when you encourage companies to pull out their investments from a particular country. So it's a method which can be used to achieve a political goal. Now moving on to the next question, which is next 1.1.3. It actually reads, define the term nationalization in your own words. So if you look at these two questions, they do not necessarily require you to refer to the source. They require you to define using your own words. So when we define a word, we actually explain our own understanding of the word, the word. So nationalization, it can be referred to the transfer of ownership. The transfer of ownership of resources the transfer of ownership of resources, or you can say of industry. It can be industry, whether it's primary, secondary, or even tertiary of industry, the transfer of ownership of resources or industry to the state or to the government. To the state or government. Or we'll just write it in short here, or government. So the transfer of ownership of resources or industry to the state or government is actually referred to as nationalization. It is when resources are controlled by the government instead of them being in private hands. So that is what we actually call nationalization. It is when a government controls resources or when a government controls the industry. It can be the farming industry, it can be the manufacturing industry, or even the tertiary industry, which is also known as what? As commerce. Now let's go to 1.1.4. What is implied by the statement that if KOSATU was committed to one person, one vote, a unitary South Africa in the context of its role as a labor movement? So what we are saying is that KOSATU wanted a democratic South Africa. That was their aim. KOSATU wanted a democratic dispensation in South Africa. In other words, they wanted a government which was made by the people, for the people, through. So KOSATU wanted a democratic dispensation in South Africa. That is the implication of this particular statement. They wanted democracy in South Africa. Or you can say they wanted democratic elections in South Africa. Wanted democratic elections. That is another way of putting it. So we have put 2 points then. They wanted, KOSATU wanted a democratic dispensation in South Africa, wanted democratic elections whereby people voted for them, voted for leaders. So you must bear in mind that during this time, there was no democracy in South Africa. People were not allowed to vote for their leaders, especially people who were coming from minority groups, people who were coming from Asian groups, and people who were coming from the African groups. They were not allowed to participate in democracy. Now, we are done with question 1A, or rather, I would say source 1A. We move on to source 1B. So the instruction says consult source 1B. If you look at 1B, we need to look at the source 1B. So 1B is actually a poster which was designed by KOSATU's media worker, Patrick Kokian, which demonstrates KOSATU's protest against the apartheid government's labor election Amendment Act that was introduced in 1987. So it actually reads no to the labor bill, no to restrictions. Then it also reads organize, resist. Then the words below read forward with KOSATU, Special Congress, Johannesburg, May 14 to 15, 1988. An injury to one is an injury to all. So that is how it reads then. So we need to respond to the questions which are stated here. Why do you think this poster was created? So you need to provide a reason why the poster was actually created. So one of the reasons which you can actually indicate is that the poster was created to mobilize support. To mobilize support. It was actually created to mobilize support from members. From members of KATU, KATU, to oppose the reforms. All right, so one of the reasons why it was formed is to mobilize. To mobilize is when you try to get people organized so that they can oppose a particular thing which you are not comfortable with. Then you can also say that to garner support. To garner support from members. It was actually designed to garner support from members. It was actually designed for that purpose. You can also say that to inform members. It was also designed to inform members. To inform members of the KATU of the action which they were about to take, which is, in this case, the strike which they wanted to embark on. So those are the possible answers which you can indicate on question 1.2. Now let's go to the next one. 1.2.2, identify evidence in the source that indicates that this was a KATU poster. So we need to go back or to revert back to the what? To the poster. So there is so much evidence from our poster which actually shows that this is a KATU poster. So one thing which I want to draw your attention to, I'll highlight it. We do have an emblem of the organization KATU on your bottom left corner. So there is an emblem which actually represents KATU. Remember, we can call it an emblem, we can call it a logo, which actually represents KATU. So I'm going to highlight it in what? In lime green. So that emblem, it actually shows that this poster belongs to KATU. In addition to that, there is also the slogan. This slogan, an injury to one, and an injury to one is an injury to all. It is actually the official slogan of the organization known as KATU. So we have two pieces of evidence which show that this is actually a KATU poster. So I'm going to write the answer there. So we have two things there. We actually have the emblem, or you can call it the logo, the KATU emblem. The KATU emblem, it actually shows that that's a KATU poster. Then in addition to the KATU emblem, we have the KATU logo as well. Logo and emblem is one and the same thing. Then we also have the slogan. An injury to one is an injury to all. That is actually the official slogan of the organization known as KATU organization. All right, going back to the question, the first question reads, quote evidence from the source suggesting that anti-apartheid groups were negatively affected by the state of emergence. So the term adversely, it simply means that they were negatively affected by the state of emergence. So the first evidence which we have, we find it in the source. We actually find it in the source. If you go back to the source, you'll find a part where they say that they had to seek the law. They had to seek the law in everything which they did. They actually had to obtain the law. I'm going to highlight it. Yeah, they will have to obtain the law and order ministers' permission to conduct any other activities. So if we try to simplify this, we can actually say that they did not have freedom to conduct any other activities. They needed the law and order minister's special permission to conduct any other activities. So they lacked freedom to conduct any other activities. All right, they lacked freedom to conduct any other activities. Any other activities. They lacked that freedom. They were not flexible. They were restricted by the state of emergency. Their activities were actually controlled by the state of emergency. Then let's go to the next question. Name two radical organizations that were of concern to the police. So our keyword there is radical. Radical, we are simply referring to organizations which are actually opposed totally to the apartheid government. So let's go back to our source 1C. You would find where they mention the radical organization. So I'm going to highlight where we are actually going to get our answer from. So the radical organizations are actually mentioned in this paragraph. In November, Security Police Chief Johan van der Meer signaled the possibility of such a crackdown when he told reporters that legal radical organizations such as the UDF, so they are related here, such as the UDF and COSATU. So then radical organization, which the question is looking for, is the United Democratic Front, which is abbreviated as the UDF. So we have the UDF, we have the UDF, then we also have the UDF. In addition to the UDF, we also have COSATU. We have two radical organizations, namely the UDF and COSATU. So I'm going to write them right below the UDF and COSATU. These are the two radical organizations which Johan van der Meer was referring to. Then the next question, 1.3.3. Why do you think the government prohibited COSATU from campaigning for the unbanning of the ANC and the release of political prisoners? All right, just like the other question, this question requires your opinion and your own understanding of the context of the events which were taking place. So the reason here, there are several reasons which you can include. You know very well that COSATU was an ally of ANC, and there were so many political prisoners who had been arrested, which were opposing the apartheid government. So release and the unbanning of the ANC would lead to the undermining of the power of the apartheid government. So this would undermine the power. This would undermine the power or the strength. It would actually undermine the power or the strength of the apartheid government. The apartheid government. The apartheid government. It will be undermined. It will be compromised. If the ANC was unbanned, it simply means that it would continue with its activities of opposing apartheid. So that would make the apartheid government actually weaker. So that's why they prohibited COSATU from campaigning for the unbanning of the ANC and the release of political prisoners. Then going on to 1.3.4, explain the concept sanctions in the context of COSATU's position in resisting the apartheid government. All right, sanctions are another method which was used by COSATU and other anti-apartheid groups to oppose apartheid. I've mentioned disinvestment as one of the methods. So in this case, they're asking about sanctions. So when you talk about sanctions, sanctions are actually a political penalty. Sanctions are a political penalty. They are actually a political penalty given to a government or to a country. To a country or government. These are actually a penalty given to a country or a government for disobeying the law. It can be international law or it can be international agreement. So if a government disregards the law, they are actually punished using what we call sanctions. It can be economic sanctions, it can be political sanctions, or it can be social sanctions. So for example, I want to contextualize this now. The apartheid government violated human rights. It actually violated human rights. So the international community, other countries from outside, community imposed sanctions. Imposed sanctions on the apartheid government. Imposed sanctions or punishments on the apartheid government. They actually imposed sanctions on the apartheid government. In order to force the government to do the correct thing, they introduced penalties. So sanctions are a political penalty given to a country or a government for disobeying the law. So the apartheid government, it actually violated human rights. So the international community imposed sanctions on the apartheid government. Okay, now let's move on to the next source, which is source 1D, which is actually source 1D. So I'm going to flip to the source, which is source 1D. This source, it actually it highlights the measures adopted by KATU during its special congress in 1988. It was in response to the threat posed by the apartheid governments and restrictions and the Labor Relations Amendment Act. So the special, this is the source, that's source 1D for you there. Now let's go back to the question and address the demands of the question. All right. The first question reads, what according to the source were the two challenges that the KATU Special Congress had to respond to on 14 May 1988? So there were some two challenges which they had to respond to. We go back to our source. We go back to our source. So the first statement in the source, it reads, the Special Congress was called in response to two specific challenges to the KATU. Then there is a semicolon in them. Then immediately after that, the two challenges are stated. So the first thing is the government's February 24 restrictions. That is the first point, which legally limited KATU to a narrow range of factory floor trade unionism and effectively banned 17 other organizations, among them the UDF and a close, which was actually a close and a formal KATU ally. So let's identify our answers there. There are two challenges there's two specific challenges. The first challenge, there were the February 24 restrictions. Then the second one, and we also have the banning of 17 other organizations which were allies of KATU. So we are going to go back to the question paper. Then we write our answer. We are going to write it above here. We're going to write it above in different color. All right. So the first restriction, or the first challenge was the restrictions imposed on KATU. That is the first thing. You can actually call them the February restrictions, the restrictions which were imposed on KATU. That is our first point. In addition to that, we can also discuss about the banning of 17 other organizations. The banning of 17 other organizations affiliated to KATU. There were other 17 organizations which were related or which were allies to KATU. So that's why these are the two challenges which KATU was facing. The restrictions imposed on KATU, then also the banning of 17 other allies. The banning of 17 other allies, it was a cause of concern for KATU. So those are the two challenges which were faced by by KATU. Now let's go to the next question, which is 1.4.2, which reads, list 3 ways from the source which show how the Labor Relations Amendment Act would affect workers and their trade unions. So they were going to be affected in so many areas. So I'm going to write the first one here. The first thing, they were stripped of their right to strike. They were stripped of their right to strike. Where are we getting it? We go back to the source. As we read through it, you can find that there were so many restrictions which start in paragraph number 3. So I'm going to highlight the restrictions which, so the bill will substantially limit the workers' right to strike. That is our first point. Open trade unions to civil action for losses incurred or experienced by members. Then also, in addition to that, the restrictions and the bill attempted to deny KATU a right woven merged into the fabric of its own existence. Then the right to operate on a national political terrain. All these were part of the ways in which the Labor Relations Amendment Act would affect workers and the trade unions. So I'm going to write all the required points. So the first one is the right to strike. Then there was also the ban. They were actually banned from taking solidarity action. Solidarity action. The ban of solidarity action is one of those things. Then in addition to that, we can add the third point, which is actually the limits to civil action. The third point would be limits to civil action. Limits to civil action. So all these are ways from the source which show how the Labor Relations Amendment Act would affect the workers and their trade unions. Then moving on to 1.4.3, explain the meaning of the statement. KATU was denied the right to operate on the national political terrain. So we need to highlight the keyword then. The keyword there would be national political terrain. So what it simply means, this is basically a figurative expression. It simply means that KATU was not allowed to operate to operate at country level. KATU was not allowed to operate at country level. Or you can put it this way. You can say KATU's activities were localized. KATU's activities were localized. So it means KATU operated at a local scale instead of a national scale. They operated on the factory floor, which means that they operated in the companies rather than at a national level. Then going on to the next question, 1.1.4, comment on what is implied by the words KATU would not knuckle, or it won't give in without a struggle in the context of the threat posed by the apartheid government. Now, this question does not require you to consult the source per se, but it actually requires your own interpretation of the events or of what is happening in this particular context. So in other words, we can actually say that KATU was not going to accept what the government was suggesting. KATU would not reluctantly accept KATU would not reluctantly accept the restrictions imposed by the government. Imposed by the government. They were not just going to accept it. They were going to take alternative action. They were not going to accept it. And you can actually say that KATU became more determined. Became more determined to oppose government. More determined to oppose the government. To oppose government. So instead of folding their hands, they became much more determined to oppose whatever the government was controlling them on. For example, when the government took away their right to strike, when they banned solidarity action, and when they also limited their civil action. So they became much more determined. They became much more opposed to the government. Then let's refer to sources 1B and D. Explain how the information in source 1B supports the evidence in source 1D regarding KATU's response to the Labor Relations Amendment Act. So let's look at source 1B. Source 1B. Source 1B. Source 1B is a visual, it is actually a visual representation, or you can call it portrayal. It is a visual portrayal of the actions taken by KATU. Remember, it is actually a of the actions taken by KATU. Remember, it's actually a poster. A poster indicating that KATU members were supposed to strike. I would go back to that source so that you can have a look at it once more. Okay, as you can see, it is actually a poster designed by KATU. So it is a visual representative, or it is a visual portrayal or representation of the actions which were going to be taken by KATU. It reads no to labor law, no to restrictions, organize and resist. So that is the first source. Now let's go back to the other source. On the other side, source 1B, it is actually an explanation. Source 1D complements. 1D complements what is in 1C. source 1D complements. It actually adds on to complements source 1B. 1D actually complements 1B. It source 1D goes on to explain. It also goes on to explain why the special Congress was called for. It also goes to explain why the special Congress was called for. So what you can say is that these two sources are actually complementary. They support one another. They actually assist one another to portray the same idea of how KATU opposed the restrictions which were imposed by the government, or how they responded to the Labor Relations Amendment Act. Now let's go to the next source, which is paragraph writing, source 1.6. When it comes to paragraph writing, we must stick to the instruction which says that you must write in a paragraph. So avoid writing in bullet form, and also avoid writing in shortened form. So you must write in full sentences as far as possible. So the question reads, using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines, which is about 8 words, explaining how KATU responded to the government's labor reforms in the 1980s. So the first point we are going to state is that KATU opposed. It was not comfortable with whatever the government was stating. KATU opposed the reforms, labor reforms rather, reforms brought about by the government. It actually opposed the labor reforms brought about by the government. So according to source 1A, according to source 1A, KATU promised to take a tough stance against government, or to take tough action, actually promised to take a very tough stance against the government. Then source 2B, or source 1B rather, is a visual representation of actions taken by KATU, which means a strike. KATU to oppose the labor reforms. Remember, it's a poster which is actually inviting people to take action. That is source 1B. Then if you move on to 1C, source 1C explains, it actually is an explanation. It's an explanation. Source 1C it explains how Minister Adrian actually explains how Minister Adric's actions affected KATU. Actually explains how their action were affected by the minister's action. Then source 1D indicates that the Congress which was called for was meant to respond to the challenges to respond to the challenges. It was actually meant to respond to the challenges spelled out by the Labor Relations Act. Labor Relations Act. Labor Relations Amendment Act. Act. So this is how our paragraph looks like. This is how our paragraph looks like. As you can see, it is roughly roughly of almost that length of 80 words or around 8 lines. So that brings us to the end of question 1. Now let's move on to the second question, which is question 2. So question 2, the key question which appears there is, how did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is also abbreviated as the TRC, expose leaders of the apartheid government for gross violations of human rights committed between 1960 and 1994? Then we are going to study sources 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D, then respond to the following questions. So we'll just briefly browse at the sources. So the first source, which is 1C, it is actually which is not 1C, it's actually source 2A rather. Question 2A, how did the TRC, the Truth and the Reconciliation Commission, expose leaders of the apartheid government for gross violations of human rights committed between 1960 and 1994? So we do have a source there. The source below has been taken from the biography of F.W. de Klerk, who was the leader of the National Party, titled A Question of Balance, a biography of F.W. de Klerk written by John Cameron Doe. All right, now let's go back to the questions. According to the source, why did the National Party support the idea of the TRC? We go back simply because the question is stating according to the source. That is our key word. So whenever a question states that according to the source, we should just do exactly like that. When you go back to the source, all right, in the first line, the National Party supported the idea of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in order to avoid responsibility. So they did it in order to avoid responsibility. So I'm going to write the answer right on top there. We get it from immediately when we get to the first line, that's when you get the answer. So you can say to the National Party supported in order to avoid responsibility for their actions during apartheid. Responsibility. In order to avoid responsibility. That's why they supported the idea. Now, the next question, it actually says, define the term amnesty in your own words. So this is a question which needs your own understanding of the concept. It's a historical concept. So amnesty can be defined as official pardon. It is actually official pardon for something which you have done, what you call it, for something which you have done. So you can also call it official forgiveness, which is often granted by the state. Ne? You can also call it official forgiveness or official pardon. For example, if you commit a crime, you can be granted what is called amnesty. So it is official forgiveness granted by to an individual by the state, which is the government. It is official forgiveness. When you do something wrong, you can be officially forgiven by the state. So we refer to that as amnesty. The next question reads, why do you think Black South Africans demanded explanations from perpetrators and not only disclosure from the National Party? So the correct answer would be explanations would help them get closure. So the first thing which would state is that explanations would help victims and also and relatives of victims it would help victims and relatives of victims to get closure, especially considering the violent and also traumatic events which happened during the apartheid era. So it would help victims and relatives of victims to get closure, or you can actually say to heal the wounds of the violent and traumatic past. Traumatic past. You know very well that apartheid was full of violence. So many people went through traumatic experiences. So explanations would help the victims and the relatives of victims to get closure and to heal the wounds of apartheid's violent past. Now, moving on to the next question, explain the implication of the statement of the Minister of Justice, who was by then Dula Omar, about the TRC to enable South Africans to come to terms with their past to advance the cause of reconciliation. So in other words, we're asking ourselves, what did the minister imply? What was he trying to say in this scenario? So you can actually, it's a question which does not need you to refer to the source as well, but it needs your own interpretation of what? Of the words of the minister. So you can actually say that the minister implied that the newly formed nation needed to deal with its violent past. It needed to deal with its violent past In addition to that, the nation needed to reconcile, needed reconciliation. The nation actually needed reconciliation in order to move into the future, face the future. The nation actually needed reconciliation. So you know very well that South Africa went through a violent past and traumatic past. So what the minister was trying to say is that there was need of dealing with the violent past, and there was also need for reconciliation, whereby people forgive one another, then they reconcile, and they start working on the future. So those are that is the implication of the statement of the Minister of Justice. Then moving on to 2.1.5, what, according to the source, were the opinions of the following regarding the granting of general amnesty by the TRC? So there are two parties which are involved here. The first was the leader of the National Party, who was de Klerk. Then we also have the ANC as a political party. So we need to look at their points of view in as far as the granting of general amnesty was concerned. So we go back again to the source. So when you go to the source, we move on to paragraph number 3. I'm going to highlight where we would extract the answer from. So the first line under paragraph number 3, it reads, F.W. de Klerk maintains that he was of the opinion that a process was required in order to enable South Africans to come to terms with the conflict of the past in a spirit of reconciliation. That is the first point of view. So in other words, we are saying F.W. de Klerk was actually in support of general amnesty. But now, when we go to the next line, the ANC has different ideas. According to the ANC, a general amnesty went much against ANC thinking. It is now common knowledge that appalling or terrible conditions, atrocities, crimes were committed in the name of state security, particularly in the closing years of P.W. Botha's presidents. So you can actually see the difference in the view here. ANC was against the granting of general amnesty, whilst de Klerk supported amnesty. So we are going to write it together, because the question reads, what, according to the source, were the opinions of the following regarding the granting of general amnesty by the TRC? De Klerk supported general amnesty. Actually supported general amnesty. The ANC opposed general amnesty. All right, so those are the two different viewpoints of the two political formations, or the individual versus ANC as an organization. So that is question 2.1.5. Now, when we study source 1B, and let's have a look at source 1B. Source 1B is actually an extract from the book written by M. Meredith, who worked as a correspondent for the London Observer. So there is the source. Now, let's go back to the questions. Quote 3 pieces of evidence from the source suggesting that Botha's government entered the realm of criminal misconduct in the 1970s. So we're going to look for incriminating evidence which Botha and his accomplices had during the time of during the closing years of apartheid. So if we look at the source, we're going to look at some of the actions. All right, let's look at the first paragraph. All right, so there's the opening line, which I'm going to highlight here, which says previous governments yet ruled by repression. But there's something which changed under Botha's rules. You went beyond ordinary repression. So the first policy was the policy of killing the opponents. Then he was also responsible for the use of torture, abduction, arson, and sabotage. Then in terms of the terminology which he liked to use, he had used terminology like eliminate, take out, and wipe out. So these are the three pieces of what incriminating evidence which we find on Botha's side. So quote three pieces of evidence from the source suggesting that Botha's government entered the realm of criminal misconduct in the late 1970s. So we are going to respond to them question here. Three pieces of evidence. So the first thing is that killing political opponents, unlike other governments, Botha was responsible for killing political opponents. That is the first point. You would actually kill anyone who was opposed to him. Then in addition to that, he used torture. Also, you talk about torture. He actually used torture. He actually used torture against his opponents. In addition to that, he also used abductions. Abduction is when you take someone against his or her will. When you use force to take someone against their will, it's called an abduction. Then he also made use of fire, deliberately setting property on fire. We call that arson. Then in addition to that, he also made use of sabotage. He used to sabotage his opponents. He used sabotage. In addition to that, he also used use of words like eliminate. Use of words like eliminate. Eliminate or wipe out. This is evidence which shows that Botha was now responsible or was now entering a new realm of criminal misconduct. Now let's go to the next question, which is 2.2.2. Explain the term third force in the context of the apartheid government's way of dealing with the ANC. All right. The term third force is actually a historical term, which was used during apartheid, the time of apartheid. So it refers to third force it actually refers to a secret force. It actually refers to a secret force, or you can call it a secret militia. A secret force believed to be responsible for violence. A secret force or militia believed to be responsible for violence during the closing years of apartheid. Responsible for violence. For violence in the closing years of apartheid. So it is a militia, or you can call it, it was actually a secret force, which was responsible for violence during the closing years of apartheid. Then in addition to that, we are going to look at 2.2.3. Comment on why you think de Klerk did not act on the allegations made by General Steyn of third force activities. So this is our own point of view. All right, so one assumption is that perhaps Botha was responsible for the third force. He was actually responsible for that. He has been accused at times in some circles. He was responsible for the third force. It was actually his baby, or you can call it his brainchild. It is believed that Botha was responsible for the third force. Then also perhaps to avoid national division. Might have done it to avoid national division, even though other people believe that he was actually responsible for the creation of the third force. Then 2.2.4, who according to the source was involved in the bombing of KATU house. So if you go back to the source, we are going to investigate who was responsible for the bombing of the house. If you move on to the last paragraph, it actually says Vandermeer had been involved in illegal activity regarding. So we are going to highlight this part. We come across, so it's Vandermeer was responsible for the bombing of KATU house. Yet he could retain, he was actually a senior policeman in the country. So our culprit in this case, it's Vandermeer. So it's Vandermeer. Vander was the culprit who was responsible for such actions. Now let's move on to source 2C. That is question 2.3. We first look at the addendum and also the source itself. So it is actually a cartoon below drawn by the famous cartoonist Zapiro, and it was first published in The Sun Times on 2 August 1998. It depicts the apartheid government's cabinet ministers who evaded. To evade is to avoid. The term evade, it actually means to avoid. So we are going to look at those culprits who actually avoided. This is to avoid. Evade is to avoid. Some who avoided accountability for the violations of human rights committed between 1960 and 1994. So let's have a look at the picture. There is the vehicle, which is actually there. This is actually the TRC vehicle. Then we also have comments. Finally, a big one. Finally, a big one. Then we also have another thing. Another observer who presumably does Desmond Tutu. You should have seen the ones that got away. Then we do have other big fish involved in the atrocities of apartheid, namely F.W. de Klerk managed to get away. Adrian Flock managed to get away as well. Then we have P.W. Botha managed to get away. Then we also have Pick Botha on the image as well. Then we have Magnus Malan also managed to escape. Now, let's go back to the question. Explain the significance of the phrase, finally, a big one in the context of the amnesty process. Explain the significance of the big one, of the phrase, the big one. All right, question 2.3.1, it reads, explain the significance of the phrase, finally, a big one in the context of the amnesty process. So if you go back to the source itself, which is source 2C, finally, the big one. If you go back to the big one, which is pointed at, we are actually looking at we are actually looking at Adrian Flock. So it simply means that this was one of the most notorious perpetrators of atrocities during the time of apartheid. So the context of these words, you can actually say that these words, or the significance of these words, that they simply mean that Flock was actually a major perpetrator in as far as atrocities were concerned during the time of apartheid. So I'm going to write correct the suggested correct response there. All right. The words imply that Locke was a major perpetrator, was actually a major perpetrator of atrocities during the apartheid era. Was one of the major perpetrators of atrocities. When you talk about atrocities, we are talking about cruel actions or things which actually violated the human rights of ordinary people. So that is the correct answer there. Then what is the implication of Tutu's words? You should have seen the ones that got away. So if you go back to the image, we do have Archbishop Desmond Tutu on the other side. Then there's a speech bubble which says, you should have seen the ones that got away. Then if you look at the images of the ones which are indicated there, we have the likes of F.W. de Klerk, then there's also P.W. Botham, then there's also Pick Botham, then there's also Magnus Malan. So now we go back to the question, what is the implication of Tutu's words? You should have seen the ones that got away regarding the TRC process. So if you look at those words, they actually mean that the major perpetrators, the biggest perpetrators of got away with their actions. The major perpetrators got away with their actions. Then smaller or less important participants the smaller or less important participants were the ones which went through the TRC process. The actual big fish, they actually managed to escape, but the less important participants went through the TRC process. Those are the implications of the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Now let's go on to source 2C. Would have a look at source 2C, 2D rather. The source is actually an extract which has been taken by confessions made by P. Erasmus. Then let's highlight this P. Erasmus. He was actually a member of the security branch of the South African police. He exposes the dark secrets of the apartheid-era policing system ordered by the National Party government and the State Security Council in the early 1980s. Now, going back to the questions, what, according to the source, was Tom Leon's view of how the National Party treated its foot soldiers? All right, so you can actually say that the National Party exposed the ordinary soldiers. The National Party exposed the foot soldiers, but protected the masterminds. They actually exposed the foot soldiers and protected the master minds of them atrocities of apartheid. So they had double standards. They actually exposed people who occupied lesser important positions, but they protected those who occupied the most important positions. So that is how the National Party treated foot soldiers. Then the next question reads, why, according to the source, did P. Erasmus mention, I felt that old anger burning bright as ever inside me regarding the meetings between ex-members, ex-ministers, generals, and the State Security Council on how to deal with the TRC. So you can actually say that he felt angered by the actions of his former superiors. He actually felt angered by the actions of his former superiors. Felt the old anger rise within him. So that is 2.4.2. Now moving on to 2.4.3, comment on why foot soldiers felt thrown away by the leadership of the government that employed them. Some, they felt that way simply because they felt they were blamed for carrying out orders given by their superiors. So they were actually blamed for carrying out orders given by their superiors. So they felt thrown away in such ways, because they were now blamed for orders which they were rightly given by their superiors. 2.4.4, why would a historian regard this source as reliable when researching the accountability of the National Party leadership to the TRR process? So one advantage about this source, it actually comes from people who were from inside. It is an inside source. So it is reliable to a large extent. The source is reliable to a greater extent. Because it is actually a confession. Is a confession or testimony from a participant or an eyewitness. Or eyewitness. That is the first advantage about this source. In addition to that, one thing which can make this source to be of good use to a historian is that it also highlights key statistics. There are some key statistics which are highlighted there. For example, I would want to say 3,500 soldiers. Then we also have important names there. We also have important names being mentioned, which are of so much importance to a historian. We do have Vandermeer being, whose name has been indicated there. Then we also have dates which are mentioned then. So the fact that it provides statistics, we can consider it to be a reliable source of what of history. So it contains the source. The source contains vital evidence. Vital evidence in the form of statistics. It contains vital evidence in the name of statistics. Names of people are also being discussed in the source. For example, when it comes to statistics, there's mention of 3,500 police officers. When it comes to names, we also have Vandermeer being discussed in the same source. Now let's go to the next question, which is 2.5. 2.5 will indicate it down there. All right, 2.5, refer to sources 2C and 2D. Explain how the information in 2C supports the evidence in 2D regarding how the leadership of the apartheid government avoided accountability during the TRC hearings. So we are going to compare two sources. So we start with the first source, which is actually source 2C. Source 2C portrays how it actually portrays how senior officials evaded from justice, evaded or avoided facing justice at the TRC. You look at the source, we can have one more look at it, which is source 2C. It shows how the big fish, the so-called big fish, or you can call them the leaders of or the architects of apartheid, they actually evaded justice. The likes of P.W. Botha, the likes of Pik Botha, Adrian Flock, and others, they actually avoided the justice system. So that's why we are saying it portrays, it gives a picture, it gives a visual representation of how some senior officials avoided being tried at the TRC. Then if we look at source D, it corroborates, or it actually it corroborates, or you can actually say that it complements. It actually complements, they agree, these two sources are agreeing. Complements source A not A, but it complements source 2C in saying that it actually complements 2C. Source D is a testimony of how junior members officers were sacrificed they were actually sacrificed at the TRC at the expense of the cabinet ministers and high-ranking officials. So that's source 2C. Now let's move on to the next question, which requires you to write a paragraph of 80 words. So it actually reads, using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of 8 lines, which is about 80 words, to explain how the TRC exposed leaders of the apartheid government for gross human rights violations committed between 1960 and 1994. So you can actually say that the TRC, so we have to indicate the question, 2.6, and perhaps we might write it in a different color so that we can distinguish it from the previous answer. The TRC protected, it actually protected. You can actually say it protected or exempted the main The main perpetrators it actually exempted the main perpetrators of apartheid. It exempted the main perpetrators of apartheid. So if you look at it, you'll find that in source 2A, source 2A states that de Klerk supported the formation of the TRC. The formation of, or you can actually speak the policy of general amnesty, perhaps to protect himself. He actually supported the policy of general amnesty. Then on the other hand, we also say that the ANC opposed the ANC opposed general amnesty. Then looking at source B also discusses how senior officials got away with human rights violations. Then you can actually continue by saying that source C is actually a visual representation of the leaders who were hardly touched by the TRC. Then source D is a testimony, or you can call it a confession by a low-ranking government official bemoaning how they were let down by their leaders. So that is our paragraph. That is our paragraph. The TRC protected or exempted the main perpetrators of apartheid. Source A states that de Klerk supported the policy of general amnesty. The ANC opposed general amnesty. Source B also it discusses how senior officials got away with the human rights violations. Then source C is a representation of the leaders who were hardly touched by the TRC. Source D is a confession by a low-ranking government official bemoaning how they were let down by their leaders. So that brings us to the end of question 2. So now we move on to question 3. Question 3 reads, how did powerful international financial institutions, namely the IMF and the World Bank, shape the globalized economies in the 80s. So we are going to refer to source 3A. You look at 3A. 3A, this is actually an extract which is taken by the book by Toyin Falola and B. House. It explains how globalization negatively affects the continent of Africa. All right, now let's go back to the questions. Going back to the questions themselves, the first question reads, define the term globalized economies in your own words. So it's a question which does not require you to refer to the source, but it requires your own words. Globalized economies globalized economies are economies or countries which are increasingly integrated. You can say integrated, which means the same as or connected. They are increasingly integrated or connected. They are more connected through the following methods: through trade, through travel, through communication, and technology. So globalized economies are economies or countries which are increasingly integrated or connected through trade, travel, communication, and technology. That is what brings those economies together. So now it says, the next question says, give 4 points of criticism, negative things of globalization as stated in the source. So we go back and refer to the source again. We look at the negatives which were stated now. All right. The first thing is that Africa is presented as unimportant, as marginal. It is actually presented as, black people are presented as marginal. Africa is only, they are only there to seek resources, and global powers or economies seek considerable benefits from their economics and political dominance, the wealth of nations. Okay. Then, in addition to that, we can actually say that we can actually indicate how the criticisms of globalization. All right. So the first thing, when it comes to points of criticism, you can actually say that Africa is presented as unimportant. Is presented as unimportant. It is presented as unimportant. That's the first point. In addition to that, globalization benefits only. It only benefits only globalized economies. And in addition to that, you can also say that Africa provides use of resources from other countries. So the use of resources from other countries. So there is the use of resources from other countries. That is another criticism. Then it only benefits globalized economies we have. Then also globalization is also accused of it destroys the environment. It also destroys the environment. So these are the three major criticisms of globalization. Now let's go to 3.1.3, which reads, using the information from the source and your own knowledge, comment on how powerful nations and financial institutions have benefited from implementation of globalization from above. All right. The first criticism, we'll find it in the source again, whereby it is indicated that Africa experiences globalization from above. Then, the actors who control globalization from above call for Africa to practice democracy, which they themselves do not practice. All right, let's go back. Using the information in the source and the owner, let's comment on how powerful nations and financial institutions have benefited from the implementation of globalization above. You can say that powerful nations dictate to poor nations. They force poor nations to implement democratic principles which they themselves do not. Do not practice. They force poor nations to implement democratic principles which themselves they do not apply, which shows the double standards. Then, in addition to that, let's go to 3.1.4. Using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain how experiencing globalization from below will be of advantage to Africa. So for this one, there are some other positive benefits of globalization. Access to what? Markets. You can actually say that access to new markets. Then the spread of, you can also discuss the spread of what? Spread of technology. You can also talk about spread to technology, then access to new industrial goods, also. All right. Having done the first question, now let's move on to the next question, which needs us to consult source B. We look at source B. Let's have a look at source B. All right, source B is actually an extract from a book by B.K. Campbell. It highlights the impact of globalization through the international financial institutions, namely the IMF and the World Bank, on African countries in the 1980s. Going back to the question, quote four pieces of evidence from the source to indicate that Africa's experience of the global crisis in the 1980s led to dependence with the West. Yeah. So we have the inability of Africa to service debt. It's resulted in dependency. So inability to service debt. Then in addition to that, countries actually go into debt. borrow from the West. Countries actually borrow from the West. In addition to that, they're also going to indicate that they borrow from the going to IMF. That's something which also shows dependency. Then we also talk about structural adjustment programs. Structural adjustment. All right, structural adjustments. Then moving on to 3.2.2, using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why assistance from the IMF and the World Bank was reluctantly accepted by some African countries. If you go back to the source, African countries, we get our answer from them. Usually they have done so reluctantly or unwillingly because they've exhausted other possibilities of obtaining finance. So our answer begins where the question says they've exhausted other possibilities of obtaining finance. Exhausted other possibilities. Other possibilities of getting finance. They would have used all the other possibilities of getting finance. So that's 3.2.2. Then the other question, or you can actually say that through desperation. This actually shows desperation. It is actually a sign of desperation. They would have exhausted all the other possibilities of obtaining finance. So they do it. So African countries or the developing countries, they would have exhausted other possibilities of getting finance, or they do that as a sign of desperation. Then moving on to 3.2.2, why do you think it is? Why do you think is implied by the statement? Not since the days of colonialism have external forces been so powerfully focused to shape the economic structure regarding the influence. So this is actually a statement which says not since the days of colonialism have external forces been so powerful focused to shape the Africa's economic structure. So what it basically means that the West and the financial institutions, the West and the financial institutions are more controlling than the colonial system, itself. They are actually more powerful than the old colonial system, which was associated with the occupation of Africa and other things. They've become much more influential in the developing world's affairs. Then the next question, explain the term structural adjustments in the context of the policies of international financial institutions regarding African countries. Explain the term structural adjustment in the context of policies of international. So a structural adjustment is actually, this is a set, a structural adjustment is a set of reforms. This is a set of reforms that a country It is a set of reforms that a country must stick to in order to get loans or financial assistance in order to get loans or financial assistance from the IMF, and the World Bank. It is actually a set of reforms that a country must stick to. In order for them to get money, they are given certain conditions. So you can call them certain conditions which they are given in order to obtain money from the IMF. Then now moving on to source 2C. If you look at 2C, it is a cartoon titled Dependency Theory, which was taken from the Development of Underdevelopment by A.G. Frank. It sheds light on the view regarding the dependency theory. So we do have the poor nations portrayed in that as the skinny men feeding the poor, the rich nations. So we have the rich nations represented as the other chubby, chubby character in the picture. Now let's go back to the question. Explain whether you consider the caption dependence theory as inappropriate to this cartoon. Yes, this can be an appropriate caption simply because it actually captures the whole essence of the dependency theory. Yes, it summarizes. All right, the caption 3.3. The caption summarizes the relationship between rich and poor nations, between rich and poor nations. Therefore, it is appropriate. It is appropriate. It summarizes the relationship between the rich and the poor nations. So in that case, we can consider it to be actually appropriate. Then let's look at the next question. So this is the answer for 3.3.1. Then why do you think the cartoon portrays the rich nations as oversized? The rich nations have benefited from the unequal relationship with the poor nation. The unequal relationship with poor nations. That's one way of putting it. You can actually say that the rich nations have benefited from the unequal relationship with poor nations, or you can also put it this way is another alternative to portray the rich nations as being greedy. To portray the rich nations as being greedy. That's another reason of doing it. Now we are studying source 3D. Identify the two positions in the source that J. Stiglitz held before he entered the world of policymaking. So there are two positions which he actually held, two positions. let's go back to the source. Identify the two positions which J. Stiglitz held. So the first, he was actually um, in university. So perhaps as a lecturer, he was actually an academic. He was actually in university. Then I left academia to serve on the Council of Economic Advisors. Then he was also an economic advisor. So these are the two positions which he held before getting into politics or into policy making. So you can say that he was an academic. He was an academic. All right, an academic, or you can say he was a lecturer in university. That is the first position. He served on the Council of Economic Advisors. He was an economic advisor. So these are the two positions which he held before he got into the job of policy making. Then let's go to the next question. Comment on why globalization is generally associated with development. Generally speaking, globalization creates new markets. It creates new markets. That is why it is associated with development. That is the first point. Then it promotes cross-border trade technology. Cross-border technology. It actually promotes cross-border technology. It promotes cross-border technology. So no wonder why it is regarded as the same as development. That's why it is associated with development. Then the next question, 3.4.3, give two examples of projects mentioned in the source that benefited from foreign aid. So we go back to our source, which is source 1D. And in the last paragraph, the second from last paragraph, rather, you'd come across projects which have benefited from globalization. So the first one we do have here, it is indicated that water education projects, they've been, as I highlight, then AIDS projects. All these are examples of projects. So we are going to transfer them to our version there. So AIDS projects. Then we also have water projects. Water projects. Then we also have literacy projects. All these are benefits accrued from globalization, whereby projects have been sponsored so that children can go to school, people can get access to water, then the fighting of the HIV and AIDS pandemic. All these are benefits. Then 3.4.4, what is implied by the statement? But too many in developing countries, globalization has not brought the promised economic benefits. It can simply be translated by saying that globalization has not benefited the majority. Globalization has not benefited the majority of citizens of world citizens. In other words, we can say that it has only benefited a few, not the rest of the world population. Then 3.4.5, explain the usefulness of the source to a historian studying globalization. Well, this source is actually useful to a historian because it is coming from someone who has worked within global institution, who is responsible for global policy making. So the source is useful because it provides a balanced view. It provides a balanced view of globalization from an inside perspective. From an inside perspective. From an inside perspective, remember the author is Stiglitz, who has worked inside the policymakers. He has been in academics, he has been in policymaking, and he provides a balanced view. He has looked at the advantages of globalization. Then on the other side, he has also explored the disadvantages of globalization. So it provides something which is more of a balanced view in as far as globalization is concerned. Now use 3 source and 3D. Explain how the information in source 3C differs from the evidence in source 3D. All right. If you look at 3C, we have to look how poor nations always tend to the IMF and World Bank. And the World Bank for assistance. They always turn to those 2 institutions for assistance. Even in desperate times, they always turn to them. Then source 3B explains the devastating effects of structural adjustment programs, the devastating effects of structural adjustment programs. Then source 3C portrays the unequal power relations between the West and the poor countries. It actually shows the unequal power relations between the West and the poor countries. Then if you look at source 1D, source 1D, or sorry, source 3D, rather. All right, source 3D is a more balanced view It is a more balanced view of the advantages and disadvantages of globalization. In some cases, globalization has benefited people. Then in some cases, it has actually affected people in negative ways. So that is our paragraph there. That is our paragraph, which actually forms the last question of our source-based question. So basically, in a nutshell, these are our source-based questions. We have done all the questions from question 1 up to question 3, which are dwelling on different topics. Hope you find this useful. Oh, thank you so much.
All right. Good afternoon, learners. Welcome to History Paper 2 Memo Discussion, November Final Examinations 2023. I'm your host, Conrad Mupinguri. In our discussion today, I'm going to take you through the essay section of our paper. Remember, section B is comprised of the 3 essay questions. I'm going to take you through the discussion of the essay questions. The first question, which is question number 4, being civil resistance within the period of 1970s to the 1980s in South Africa. And our essay focus is on the Black consciousness. I think you are all aware of the concept of Black consciousness, the philosophy of Black consciousness. Right. So let's go through our question. Let's check our question. Also, let's analyze how we are supposed to answer that particular question in this instance. Right. Our question number 4 says, the Black consciousness movement believed that Black people should liberate themselves psychologically and be self-reliant in their struggle to challenge the apartheid government of the 1970s. Do you agree with the statement? Use a relevant evidence to substantiate your line of argument. But in this discussion, I think I don't need to dwell much on how we are supposed to structure our essay questions, because I think all are now familiar with how the essay should be structured. The structure of the essay being it that it should have the body, it should have the introduction first, then it should have the body, and it should have the conclusion. And also in that context, we are saying our introduction should be contextualized, which means the introduction should address the question, should address the historical question being asked in the question. And also, it should have a stance, which will mean that you should have a side of your argument. It should have a line of argument that you are adopted. And it also implies that you should give the reasons as to why you have opted for that line of argument. You need to highlight some historical evidences that you're going to use in the discussion, which substantiate why you chose that side of the argument, that stance that you have adopted in the introduction. And you should also orient the reader what the reader should expect in the discussion, as the discussion unveils what is the reader going to meet in the discussion. That is basically the introduction. We do not need to spend much time on that, but rather what our focus is on today, we need to spend more time looking at the concepts and linking them how they should address the question given in this instance, right? And also, as you go into the body of your essay, you are advised that you give a brief background. As the first paragraph of your presentation, you need to highlight a brief background, a brief historical background, such that the reader is able to understand. For the reader to be able to understand the series of events which happened in history, at least they should have a picture of what the situation was like previously, or should have a picture of what the historical perspective was like before the unveiling of the events in the answering of the question. So that is the second part that you should also address in this instance. Then, as usual, when you are addressing your points, ensure that your points are in chronology. You link or you put your points in the sequence of history. You start with the first event, going to the second event, going to the third event, 1960, 1961, 62, 63, going in that sequence. Not starting from 1970, you go back to 1965, you go to 1963, you touch on 1969. That is not chronological order. We need to put a series of events in chronology. That is how we present our facts when we are doing the presentation. And also what we need to note, we also need to abide by the peel structure of your essay. You should always make sure that each and every point constitutes its own unique paragraph, and the paragraph conforms to the peel strategy. I think that is, you're all familiar with the peel strategy, which implies that for every point identified, it should have some form of explanation. You are giving more evidence to that particular historical event, or you are giving more details to the highlighted historical point. And on top of that, you need to substantiate that by giving historical evidence. In any instance, for an historical event to be understood better, it needs to be substantiated with tangible historical evidence, which supports or which substantiates the fact that you have highlighted in your presentation. And you should always link your points. After end of your particular points that you have identified, ensure that at the end, you link that particular point. So you need to link, like when you are linking, when you are providing a link for a given question, you are referring back to your line of argument. You are relating your point to your line of argument, or you are relating back your point to the question. That's the last part of the linking. So when you are following your essay structure for every paragraph, it should start with a P, which is a point. Then it goes to an E, which is an explanation. And after the explanation, we need also to have some forms of evidence. You need you to highlight evidence. Then after the evidence, then you go to the linking. You are now referring back to your line of argument, or you are now referring back to the question, which implies that if you are following this structure of essay writing, if you are adopting the peel, your essay, you won't go astray, because you will always be referring back to the question, which means if a point is invalid, you will fail to relate it back to the question, which means as long as you are following the pure structure of the essay, your essay, you won't go astray. You will still be within the prefixes of the prescribed way of presentation, or you will be still aligning your discussion to the question asked in at any point in your presentation. So ensure that when you are having your paragraphs, they should conform to the pure format of presentation, which is the point, explanation, and let's go some historical evidence or examples. Then you have to link by referring back to the line of argument that you have adopted. Right. That is just a reminder on how we attack the essay questions in history. Then lastly, we have a conclusion. Your conclusion, you should tie up your points. And when you're concluding, you cannot introduce a new thing in the conclusion. And also, you cannot repeat exactly what you said in the essay, but rather you are giving the reader an overall impression of what you were telling them in the discussion. You are summing up your points, you are tying up your discussion, you are concluding your discussion. Right, let's go to our question in this instance. Right, our question is question number 4, the Black Consciousness Movement. Right, our question says the Black Consciousness Movement believes that Black people should liberate themselves. We should try to understand the question before we start answering. Liberate themselves psychologically and be self-reliant in their struggle to apartheid government of the 1970s. So our question is based upon the historical concept of Black consciousness. That's our concept in question, is solely based upon the Black Consciousness Movement. And what about the Black Consciousness Movement? It's a belief that Black Consciousness Movement's target was to liberate Blacks psychologically. What is psychological liberation in this instance? We are saying Blacks were supposed to be independent in terms of their way of thinking. They were supposed not to follow the perspective of the white way of thinking, or not supposed to obey, or not supposed to oblige themselves to the white way of thinking, but rather they were supposed to come out with their own way of thinking, which was at liberty with what the apartheid government was trying to enforce upon them as a people. So that was the psychological liberation. They were supposed to liberate themselves psychologically, which means their mindsets were supposed to be changed. Their way of thinking was supposed to be changed. Their philosophy of life was supposed to be changed. That is the psychological liberation. It all has to do with the mind. Then they were also supposed to be self-reliant in their struggle. They were not supposed to rely on the white men. Black people were supposed to have self-reliance, be it economic reliance. They were supposed to have identified their own way of life. They were supposed to fend for themselves and not rely on the white government, as they were struggling with the apartheid government, as they were trying to bring out change to their lives. By fighting the apartheid government, they were supposed to liberate themselves psychologically, which meant they were supposed to change their mindset. They were supposed to recognize themselves as a people on their own and not to keep in the bondage of thinking in the white man's way of thinking. And also they were supposed to be self-reliant, which meant that they were supposed to fend for themselves. They were supposed to identify opportunities for themselves, which would make them self-sustain and not depend on the white man. That is the question. That is the idea behind the question. Then in this instance here, what we need to do here, our question is asking about, do you agree with the statement? In this instance, we have to agree with the statement. This is a very valid historical concept. This is a very valid historical statement, which we cannot disagree to. We have to agree to the statement. That is our line of argument that we need to adopt in this instance. Because we know about Black consciousness, we have covered Black consciousness idea as a philosophy, and we know the targets of Black consciousness. These are some of the aspects that were addressed by Black consciousness movement to liberate Black people psychologically, for them to do away with self-pity. And also, they were supposed to be self-reliant and not rely on the apartheid government. These are principles that were vested by the Black consciousness movement. So we cannot deny this. This is a very valid historical statement, which we should agree to. Then what you only need to worry about is to identify relevant historical evidence or relevant evidence to substantiate our line of argument. We have to support it that this statement, we agree to it. We are agreeing to the fact that Black consciousness was believing that Black people should liberate themselves psychologically, and also Black people should be self-reliant as they are fighting to challenge the apartheid government of the 1970s. So in this instance, in my introduction, I will choose to adopt a stance which is in line with the historical statement. I am in agreement to the given statement. So as an example, I can introduce my essay as, indeed, it is historically agreeable that the Black consciousness movement believed that Black people should liberate themselves psychologically and be self-reliant in their struggle to challenge apartheid government of the 1970s. I have adopted a stance. I have shown that I am agreeing to the fact that Black consciousness vested those principles in its way of running. It was believing that Black people were supposed to liberate themselves, and also was believing that they were supposed to be self-reliant. I have agreed to that. That is my line of argument. Then I also said, when you have adopted a line of argument, you should give the because part. Why am I saying that Black consciousness was targeting to make people self-reliant and also make Black people liberate themselves psychologically? I need to highlight some historical evidences. I need to give an outline of the historical evidences that I'm going to describe, or that I'm going to dwell on much, or that I'm going to give detail in the discussion to come. So I will continue. The Black consciousness philosophy instilled a sense of pride. It also instilled a sense of worth and self-confidence among its Black people. I have given some piece of historical evidence which I'm going to use in the presentation. I'm talking about Black people being conscientized about their self-worth, and Black people having to uphold a sense of pride for themselves, and also to have confidence amongst themselves, and also to have unity. Those are some of the precepts of the Black consciousness movement. And here in the introduction, I am not explaining them. I'm just listing them as historical pieces of evidence. I'm going to explain them in the discussion to come. Then I need to orient the reader. I need to show the reader a direction. Where does the reader expect to go with the discussion? Where will the discussion take the reader to? What will they do through the presentation? I have to orient the reader. So what I will say in this instance, we'll continue by saying this presentation will further elaborate on the influence of Black consciousness movement towards psychological liberation and the self-reliance in Black people as a struggle against apartheid. That will conclude my introduction. I've addressed the basic precepts which are required in the introduction. My introduction is with a line of argument. It has got some pieces of historical evidence, and it has given the reader an orientation of what they are expecting to find as they go through the presentation. Right. Before I go into the points answering this particular question here, in as much as we want to cover everything, we might not exhaust all the points, or we might not exhaust the points as in the structure of the essay. That we raise every point, we explain it, we link it, we give evidence, and we link it. Some of the points we might not be able to elaborate on all of them, because that might take us a worthwhile maybe 3 or 4 hours to complete that one question, which won't be conducive and which won't be type effective. Right. So what you need to do here, I'll give you an outline of what you're expected to cover in this particular essay. Like what I said, after you are done with the introduction, you are supposed to give a brief background so that the reader has got a clear understanding of what the Black consciousness was, where did the idea come from, what was its purpose, what did it seek to achieve, what was its motive, and why did the people affiliate themselves to the movement, and what was the rationale for people affiliating themselves to such a movement. Right. I want to elaborate on the brief background of the South African history. I think it's clear for most of you, you are aware of the history of South Africa, given the time of apartheid. There were so many liberal movements which wanted to resist, which wanted to show resistance, or which apparently wanted to resist the moves by the apartheid government. There were political activists, there were political parties which were formed. For example, the renowned ANC was one of the political movements which were opposing the apartheid practices from the white government. And we saw that with movement of time, what the government did, I can take you back to the defiance campaign. People defied the orders from the white regime as prescriptions, like the segregation practices, the Separate Amenities Act. People were resisting such through the defiance campaign. They went on a massive campaign to defy the orders. And also the past laws, people were resisting them. And we can trace the series of events until we get to the Sharpeville massacre, where the police became violent against protesters and fired shots on civilians. And after the Sharpeville massacre, the government saw that it was losing ground. It was losing control of the South African citizens. Then it implemented some very strict repressive measures to try and limit resistance at any cost, to try and limit people from showing any form of resistance against the prescribed laws that were put in place by the apartheid government. So after the Sharpeville massacre, that was when we can highlight the brief background of the Black consciousness philosophy. Now you can see that political parties have been silenced. They have been banned. The ANC was banned. The PAC was banned. And also, the political activists, the majority of them were jailed. They were in prison. They were imprisoned for different offenses that they had committed during their effort to try and defy against the apartheid practices. So some of them were in prison, and also some of them had gone into exile. They were fearing for their lives. Some of them, they were fearing for prosecution and persecution at the same time. So they had chosen to go and operate from outside South Africa. So they were acting underground. Some of them who were still in here, some were acting in exile, some were in jail. The political parties were banned. So there was very little resistance. While the government had implemented such strict repressive measures against the citizens of South Africa, against Black citizens of South Africa, which meant that there was need for a new way of resistance, given that political parties were banned, given that the activists were in jail, some of the activists were in exile. Then what next? Were Black people supposed to just keep to themselves and just look at things happening like the way they were happening? Till when? There was need for a new mentality. There was need for a new way of thinking to oppose again the apartheid practices that were being still perpetrated by the National Party government. So what happened was like, Blacks had to come up with a new strategy of challenging the regime, which came in the form of the Black consciousness philosophy. And these ideas can wholly be attributed to the good works of Steve Bantu Biko. He was the man behind the wheel. When we're talking of, whenever we talk of Black consciousness, we have to talk of this renowned guy who was Steve Bantu Biko. This is the prominent father figure of the Black consciousness ideas. What was his philosophy towards emancipation of Black people and towards resistance to apartheid? He took a different stance. He did not want to adopt the stance which was taken by the liberation movement. He did not want to take the same stance which was taken by the ANC. Remember, the ANC got to enroll itself in the program of action, where the ANC Youth League was now adopting a more aggressive way of resisting apartheid than the old way of resisting that was adopted by the older ANC. The ANC Youth League was coming out with new strategies of resisting apartheid, like influencing people to resist through the defiance campaigns. So now, given that the political parties were silenced and were banned, there was a need for a new way of resistance. There was need to come out with a new plan of resistance, which won't jeopardize people's lives and also which won't risk people getting into jail. That way was to emancipate Black people, was to conscientize Black people about their self-worth. Black people were supposed to be made aware that they were also superior. They were also a distinct group of people that were supposed to be realized as superior, not only the whites. So it targeted to conscientize Black people so that they have a sense of worth. They realize themselves as worth. And also they should uphold confidence amongst themselves. Remember, through apartheid practices, Black people were segregated. They had the worst amenities to use. So they had lost confidence in themselves. They could not equally regard themselves as the whites. They were treating themselves as second-class citizens, given the segregation that they were exposed to. So Black consciousness wanted to revive that superiority amongst the Black people. And also Black people had got self-pity. They were feeling pity for themselves. They were regarding themselves as inferior and useless, given the treatment that they were receiving from the apartheid regime. So Black consciousness was also targeting to revive that spirit amongst the Black people of not them feeling self-pity for themselves, but rather be confident people, be people of a particular ranking of confidence. whereby Black people would emancipate themselves and treat themselves also as equals to the whites. Right. Then basically, that is the background that we can talk about when we're talking of the Black consciousness movement. That was the idea behind that. Political parties were silenced, activists were imprisoned, activists were in exile, and there was very little resistance. And the government had put in place so much repressive measures to try and limit any form of resistance amongst the Black people. Then there was need for a new movement to resist. And Black consciousness came as a philosophy. It was a way of life. It was not a movement like the political movements, but it was a way of life. It was incorporated amongst the livelihoods of people. It was incorporated amongst the way of doing life that Black people were supposed to follow, because it was a philosophy, a way of life. Right. What happened with this guy again? What we can also add as background information, we can trace the history of Steve Biko to university, still in university. That was when he started his political aspirations and apparently came out with the decision of conscientizing Black people about the Black consciousnness movement. With the Students' Union, that was when he got into political activism. He joined the Common Students' Union, which was there in universities of South Africa, which was the Union of South African, National Union of South African Students, which was termed the NUSAS. It was termed the NUSAS, which meant it was termed the NUSAS. This was the Common Students' Union, which was there in university. The National Union for South African Students. Right, this was a multiracial students representative union. This union comprised of multi races. It was comprised of Black people, it was comprised of white people. Then, you see, when we are combined and we have different motives, we have different ideologies, the main purpose of the organization is diluted. We might not be able to reach our core concept. We might not be able to post ahead or to pose ahead our ideology because of the dilution that is brought about by different races. We are fighting against the white man, and the white man is still infusing his ideas into the same organization which we are affiliating to. That did not work well for Steve Biko. And also there was an issue of separate amenities which was advocated by the NUSAS. The Union of South African Students, it advocated for separate amenities for Black and white students in the university. They said that they approved that Black students should not share the same amenities with white students. That did not go well with Steve Biko and his colleagues, because already they had in mind that they were supposed to conscientize Black people that we are not worthless. We are also equal to these white guys. So the first implication of Steve Biko's ideas was him breaking away from the National Union of South African Students to form their own political organization or students' union, which was called the SASO. Right? This was South African Students Organization. Right. This organization, the SASO, the breaking away from NUSAS to SASO, was a very clear implication that Steve Biko was not happy with what the Students' Union was doing. The Students' Union was not taking care or was not fending for the need of Black learners or for Black students in university, but rather was advocating for the privileges of the white students in university. That is why they chose to break from the National Union of South African Students to form their own union, which was the SASO. And Steve Biko was elected the president of the union upon its inception in 1968. Then we are now seeing that they have formed an organization of their own, which is Black controlled, which is centered upon Black principles, which upholds the philosophy that Black learners wanted to achieve, or which sought to fulfill the desires of the Black learners. It also meant that their ideologies now would freely flourish in this organization. They will now be able to influence each other in a given direction that they desired. because now there's no more influence of the white learners within the same organization. It was now an organization which was upholding the needs, and it's going towards the direction that is sought to be achieved by the Black students in university. That was how Steve Biko got to start his movement and apparently come out with the Black consciousness movement. Right. How we're going to discuss this, I'm going to split this discussion into the implications of Black consciousness towards different sectors of South African citizens. Right. My first port of call, I'm going to address the implication of Black consciousness towards instilling Blacks with pride to challenge apartheid, instilling Blacks with pride and also conscientizing Blacks about their self-worth to challenge apartheid. That is how I'm going to address it first. I'm going to look at how Blacks were conscientized so that they were able to challenge apartheid, how Black consciousness tried to change the mentality of Black people, tried to liberate the Black people psychologically so that they are able to challenge apartheid. That is one port of call. Then I'm also going to look at how Black people, how Black consciousness influenced Black political organizations. How did it influence the way through which Black political organizations were running so that they were also able to challenge apartheid? Then I'll also go and look at another aspect which involves how Black consciousness instilled students with self-belief. Remember, we've talked about Steve Biko being in university training to become a medical doctor. In this instance, we're also going to look at how he influenced the students in universities, in colleges, in high school to challenge apartheid through liberating their mindsets and also through initiations to make them self-reliant. Then we're also going to look at how he tried to make Black people self-reliant through community projects. There were different projects that were taken into consideration and that were implemented through Black consciousness movement, and we're also going to look at them. Then we're also going to look at how Black consciousness tried to influence workers, the workforce. How was it influenced by the ideas of Steve Biko? How did the Black consciousness movement try to influence the workforce to challenge apartheid, to liberate their mindsets, to have them realize their self-worth, and also to liberate them from relying on the white man? So that is basically how I'm going to make this presentation. I'm going to divide it in those spectrums. So I will start with how Black consciousness assisted in the restoration of pride, or instilling Blacks with pride and self-worth. Right. Let me indicate my key point here. Right. I will talk about Black consciousness instilling pride. So it's BC movement instilling pride, self-worth, and also doing away with self-pity. These are some of the aspects that I need to address. I want to address how Black consciousness changed the mindset, because we are saying Black consciousness was the key driver towards the liberation of Black people, the psychological liberation of Black people, which meant that the mindset of the Black people were supposed to be changed through infusion of Black consciousness ideas. So how were they doing that? They were trying to instill pride. If you are proud of yourself, automatically you have got independence of the mind. If you can not depend on the next person psychologically, it means you're independent on your own. And if you have pride about yourself, it means you also have self-confidence. So we want to look at how the Black consciousness was trying to change Black people's mindset so that Black people realize their self-worth. Black people realize there's instilling pride in Black people and also upholding the confidence amongst Black people, and also doing away with the effect of self-pity. Black people were feeling pity for themselves and were treating themselves as second-class citizens due to apartheid segregation. So we want to see how our Black consciousness assisted our Black people to change their mentality, to change their mindset. How did Black people realize their self-worth? Right. The first aspect that we need to address here, right, Black people were made to be proud about themselves with Black consciousness ideology. Black consciousness ideology tried to infuse pride amongst the Black people so that they become proud of themselves. Instead of them disregarding themselves or regarding themselves as second-class citizens, now with Black consciousness ideas, they were now realizing themselves as also superior, and also they were proud of them being Black. And with Black consciousness, there was this saying which was constantly used to further elaborate the fact that Black people should uphold their self-pride, the fact that a Black is beautiful. This is a very important aspect, even up to the current Black people. We have to still remind ourselves that a Black is beautiful. Black being a color is beautiful. How do we relate Black to a bed, to the bed? Well, it is also a color same as white. So Black is beautiful. It was one of the statements which was upheld during the Black consciousness ideology. Black is beautiful. We were trying to uphold the sense of pride amongst Black people, such that they don't feel inferior. They don't relate white to superiority and relate Black to inferiority, but rather Black is beautiful. It's a sense of pride which was tried to be infused into Black people, such that in their attempt to challenge white people, if they have got confidence and if they are thinking that if they are proud of themselves, they would challenge the apartheid regime with confidence, because they will be having self-pride. Instead of them feeling pity for themselves, they were now proud of themselves, and they were now able to pose a meaningful challenge to the white regime, given that they were infused with the mentality of pride amongst themselves. Then also Black consciousness was targeting to enable Black people do away with self-pity. I think I've talked about self-pity. Right, self-pity. You feel inferior. You feel pity for yourself. Given now that I'm a Black person, what am I going to do with my life? How am I going to survive in this world? Me being Black, how am I going to make a living in my life? How am I going to fend for my children? How am I going to fend for my education? Where am I going to stay? What am I going to do in the future? What does the future hold for me? That is a sense of self-pity. A Black person on a Black land, feeling pity for themselves, being unable to determine their destiny. So the sense was like, Black consciousness was trying to make Black people realize that they should do away with this thing of self-pity. They should not be pitiful about themselves. Them being Black is not an accident, but it's nature. But being Black does not compromise your quality of life. You can still make it despite you being Black. So why are you feeling pity for yourself? They were trying to infuse such mentality amongst the Black people so that they were able to do away with the self-pity mentality. And also the inferiority complex. Black consciousness was trying to assist Black people do away with the inferiority complex. Inferiority complex, we are saying an individual just treat themselves or do just regard themselves as inferior. You treat yourself as inferior. The moment you meet a white person, you regard yourself as second. Why? Because it's a mindset. Not it's because something which is or which should be upheld, but it's because of Black people having that mentality that whites were superior to them. So instead of you having the same or equal standing as the white person, we're supposed to take the second option. If a white person has to occupy the best facility, then you have to go to the worst facility. Then why was that like that? Why was it like that? It was because also, not because the whites were forcing it upon the Black people, but it was also because the Black people had got to accept it in their mindset. So Black consciousness was targeting to do away with that mindset, because Black people had accepted that they were inferior and they had taken that as an inferiority complex amongst themselves. They were regarding themselves as second-class citizens, which meant that in any perspective, they would not opt for the first opportunity, or they would not opt for the equal opportunity to the whites, which meant that whatever they were doing, they were giving themselves a second chance. They were giving themselves the second option because they would not opt for the first option, given that their mindset told them that they were second-class citizens. So Black consciousness was also targeting to remove the inferiority complex amongst Black people. And also, self-alienation. It was also one of the aspects that Black consciousness sought to do away with. Self-alienation, right? When we're talking of self-alienation here, we are saying Black people were making themselves aliens. An alien are looking at a foreigner. And why? South Africa, being a country which was originally occupied by the indigenous races of Africa, which were the San and the Khoikhoi, but you find that people who are still surviving around, they were treating themselves as aliens for the sake that they had adopted a mentality which denied them an equal opportunity to the whites. So they were regarding themselves as aliens. So that self-alienation was like, we would say we are second-class citizens and we should not be belonging to the same area, like we should not be belonging to the same residential places where white people stay, because our minds would tell us we are foreigners in this. We should not be in urban areas because the pass laws have denied us a right to be in urban areas without a pass. Then we are aliens in an urban area. Without a pass, you are an alien and you don't deserve to be there. And Blacks were alienating themselves in all dimensions. In facilities, they were alienating themselves because they would feel like the best amenities were not for them. So they would regard themselves as aliens the moment they see themselves in those facilities. So Black consciousness was also targeting to ensure that Black people do away with that mentality, to ensure Black people resist from that kind of thinking, right? And also domination. Domination from external forces. Black people were agreeing to domination from external forces. Whenever there was a white person, they would oblige to whatever they were saying. Whoever was supposed to give directions to them, as long as they were white, they were going to follow those directions because they had accepted that they were dominated. They had accepted in their minds that whatever the white person says was good for them and they were supposed to follow it. So they had accepted a way of life which is they were subjects in any dimensions, which meant that the white man was a superior man and was the one who was supposed to give directions, while the Blacks had accepted a domination from the white race. So they were supposed also to cast out that mentality from them so that they become a confident group of people and they realize their self-worth and they become proud of themselves. And also to have a sense of identity. It's also another very important concept which was supposed to be fulfilled by the Black consciousness ideology, right? We have a sense of self-identity. Identify yourself as Black. Don't try to affiliate yourself to the whites. For what reason? Because they are white and because you are Black. Then you want to deny yourself and you want to relate yourself more closer to the whites than to your fellow Blacks. Blacks were supposed to have that sense of identity. We are Blacks and we are Blacks for a reason. We are Blacks and we are there to stay. Then what? So that was also another aspect which was supposed to be fulfilled by Black consciousness, sense of self-identity. And also can talk of Blacks accepting themselves. There were some Blacks who were not accepting who they were. Because they were Black, now they were regarding themselves as second-class citizens. They were not accepting themselves. So they were not supposed to follow that mentality. They were supposed to be liberated from that mindset and have a new mentality where they would accept themselves as Black and also have self-reliance. This one, we're going to look at it in detail on its own. But it was also a mentality which was supposed to be infused amongst Black people. Instead of us relying on the white man, instead of us fighting to work for the white man, Why don't we come out with ways of survival where we can survive on our own without relying on the white men? Why would we still follow on the government to take care of us? Why would we still want our needs and our needs and wants to be fulfilled by a government which is discriminating us? Why can't we come out with survival strategies which we can sustain on our own without relying on the white men? That was self-reliance. So basically, that was how Black consciousness was targeting to emancipate Black men from the inferiority complex which was infused in them, and also from the way of thinking whereby Black people had lost their confidence, Black people had lost their self-worth, Black people had lost their pride. So Black consciousness was targeting to instill back such a mindset, to liberate the Black people psychologically, to change their way of thinking so that they think in another direction. They think in other terms, not in the terms that they were thinking along, because of the continued domination by the whites and also the continued exposure to segregatory practices by apartheid. They were supposed to come out with a new way of thinking, which was now being infused into them through the Black consciousness movement, which we can give credit to the ideas of Steve Bantu Biko. That is the first aspect that I've addressed. Then I've got the second aspect of Black consciousness to influence on the liberation of Black people as mentality, and also trying to achieve self-reliance. Right. We are going to look at the influence of Black consciousness on political organization. Right. How did Black consciousness try to influence some political movements, some organizations, to try and resist the prescriptions of apartheid? What was the influence of Black consciousness on political organizations? How did it try to influence political organizations to try and resist apartheid? How did Black consciousness try to change the mentality of Black people so that they will resist apartheid practices in political organizations? Right. What we can refer back here, we can briefly refer back to the history of Steve Biko, which we have mentioned earlier on when we were talking about the background information. We talked about the National Union of South African Students, which Steve Biko broke away from and his colleagues to form the South African Students Organization. This was one of the best moves that he ever made, because the implication that was here with this students' union was that it was infused with white domination. People who were in this political organization, who were in this students' union, they were following the ideologies of the whites, and they were dominating, which meant that ideologies of Black people would not be fulfilled in such an organization which is dominated by the whites. The whites are against Blacks. The whites are after segregating Blacks. Then you want them to fulfill your demands. They definitely would not fulfill the demands. Like the implication that they accepted separate amenities for students, that Black students should not use the same amenities as white students in the same university. That was an indication that this organization was not after to fulfill the demands or the needs or to satisfy what the Black men wanted. But this movement here from NUSAS to SASO, it's a clear indication that Steve Biko wanted to have an organization in which his ideas would flourish. Now they've created their own organization, and then given now that all the people who were affiliating to the organization had got the same mindset, were infused with the ideology of Black consciousness. It meant that whatever they were going to discuss here was going to further their ideology towards resisting apartheid, was going to empower them to resist apartheid in a more devised way, because they had shared ideologies. They now had a shared vision of how to resist apartheid. And also, they were frustrated with the first organization that they had joined. So it meant that whatever they were going to discuss here was going to be beneficial for them and was going to work in favor of them, because they were now liberated from the movement which was white dominated. That was 1916. Hey, right. Then let's go to the other implication. And here we also have to note that the students here who were affiliating to SASO, they were now adopting the Black consciousness philosophy. Their way of life was now based upon the ideology of Black consciousness. They were now upholding a sense of pride amongst themselves. They were now having a sense of identity as Black learners, as Black students in university. They were now having to accept themselves as Black, not to try and alienate themselves or not to try to take themselves as inferior. They were now upholding their superiority. They were now resisting domination from external forces. And also, they were upholding the sense that Black is beautiful amongst themselves as a group of people in university. They were self-emancipated to the extent that they were now proud of themselves, which means whatever they were doing here, they were doing it for the sake of the upholding of the superiority of the Black race and not for the interest of the whites. They were now doing it on the side of the Blacks. So whatever they were doing was now biased towards the philosophy of our Black consciousness. Then we can also go on and look at the implication on the formation of other organizations as a result of the Black consciousness movement. We can talk of one main important organization that was formed as a result of Black consciousness ideology, right? It was called the Black People as Convention, right? This was, we can term it the vehicle of BC, Black consciousness philosophy. What was this Black People's Convention? Right, the Black People's Convention, it was a compilation of different sectors of Black people amongst the South African society. It comprised of students, and also it comprised of churches, and also it comprised of communities, people from communities, and also it comprised of some trade unions were affiliating themselves also to the Black People's Convention. The Black People's Convention was a gathering of Black South African citizens to try and uplift their spirit of Black consciousness, to try and uplift and assist each other towards the upholdment of the sense of pride of a Black person, to try and uplift the spirit so that they would keep the spirit going. They would keep the struggle, they would keep at the seat of the struggle against apartheid going. So they would gather the people from the churches, community members, trade union members, students. They would gather constantly to remind themselves about the need to resist apartheid, about to revive their spirit, about the challenge towards the apartheid regime. So that Black People's Convention was apparently a vehicle whereby they would share the ideology of Black consciousness. They would help spread the ideology of Black consciousness in all dimensions of the South African community. So that was a gathering which was perpetrating the spread of the Black consciousness ideology amongst our South African citizens. So it was formed as a result of the need to spread the message, the need to conscientize Black people that now it's time to realize our self-worth. Now it's time to have self-confidence among ourselves. Now it's time to self-rely on our own. So they were trying to change the mentality of all the Black South Africans in the broader spectrum by trying to infuse those ideologies and trying to make people as independent psychologically as was possible on their way to the challenge to apartheid regime. That was the Black People's Convention, right? And also, we can also talk of other organizations that came into existence as a result of the Black consciousness ideology, right? There were unions that came into existence as a result of the Black consciousness ideology. And we had unions which were aligning to the Black consciousness ideology, which meant that those unions, they were following the ideology and they were upholding the ideology of a Black consciousness. Number one, we have what was called the Black Parents Association. It was a gathering by Black parents, whereby they would share the ideology of Black consciousness, they would uplift the spirit of each other, and they would try to infuse with each other the ideologies of Black consciousness, the ideology of self-worth, the ideology of self-reliance, the ideology of doing away with self-pity amongst Black parents. It was affiliating itself towards Black consciousness ideology. So it was a union which was formed, but its ideology or its perception of operation was biased towards the ideologies of a Black consciousness. Then we also had the other union, which was called the Black Allied Workers Union. The Black Allied Workers Union, which was also termed the BAUU. Right. This one also was an organization which was dominated by Black workers. The Black workers, they were also emancipating themselves, given that they were exposed to harsh working conditions, they were exposed to poor pay conditions, and all those sorts of ill treatment in the white men's factory. They got together and also infused themselves with the Black consciousness ideology. They started realizing their self-worth. They started coming out with ideologies and coming out with a way of conscientizing each other that they were worth and not worth to be treated unfairly by the white men. So those were movements which were created as a result of the spreading of the ideology of Black consciousness by Steve Biko. And also, we can also talk of the South African students movement. It was also one of the organizations which was formed as a result of the ideology of Black consciousness. This is South Africa Students Movement. Right. This was formed in 1972. What was it about the South African students movement? Right. This one here was for students in high school. Students in high school were also affiliating themselves to the ideology of Black consciousness. Remember, they were exposed to the unfair boundary education system, where they were made to do those practical subjects, those inferior subjects, which were training them to work for the white men, and were denied a right to quality education. They were learning in overcrowded conditions. They were learning in uncomfortable conditions where the teacher-to-learner ratio was very high and was unmanageable. They were exposed to the worst infrastructure in the schools. So they were not also happy with how they were treated. So they tried also to come out with an organization which was going to spread the message, was going to spread the ideology, was going to change the mentality of learners in high school so that they have a different mentality. They change their mindsets to a mindset of an emancipated Black learner. So that was also another organization that came into existence as a result of the ideologies of Black consciousness. Right. And with the government seeing that, I think one of the most important aspects that we're supposed also to mention was the reaction of the government to Black consciousness ideology. Initially, when the Black consciousness got into existence, the government was not even worried about it, was even happy. The white government was even happy to find out that Black people were now trying to come out with a way of self-sustenance. They were so happy. They were thrilled by the development because they were adopting a policy of separate development. They did not want to uplift areas that were dominated by Black people. Remember the homelands. They did not want to put any form of development in the homelands. And also, they did not want to target to emancipate the Black men. So when they see Black people trying to emancipate themselves, trying to come out with ideas of self-reliance and whatever, they were happy. They felt now that the Black man is doing his own thing and we should just ignore them. Since we have adopted the policy of separate development, we are targeting to develop where we are best and not where they are. So since they are developing where they are, let them do what they are doing. But later on, they became worried after seeing that the ideology was spreading, was becoming a veiled fire, was getting right across South Africa and was changing the mindset of Black people. Black people were now resisting to their prescriptions. They now became worried. They started arresting the leaders of Black consciousness. And the arrest of the Black consciousness leaders led to the heightening of political activism. People now were resisting, were now heightening their form of resistance, given that their leaders were being arrested. They had tried to come out with a new ideology of resistance, which is non-violent, but now their leaders were being arrested. They heightened also, they increased also the pace at which they were resisting. They also increased the way at which they were mobilizing people to have self-worth and the way they were mobilizing people to change their mindsets. Right. That is basically the influence of Black people on Black consciousness in political organizations. Right. We need also to go and look at the influence of political organizations, the influence of Black consciousness on students. Influence of Black consciousness. Black consciousness movement on students. Right, we have talked about the two organizations. We had SASO. SASO was for universities and colleges. And we had the SASM, South African Student Movement, which was for high school. These were the two movements which were dominating the influence of Black consciousness among students. This being for university and this one being for the high school learners. How did they try to influence? The very most key aspect that we need to note here is the Soweto uprising. We cannot talk of the Soweto uprising of 1975 without talking of the Soweto uprising of 1976, without talking of the Black consciousness idea. Because the Soweto uprising can clearly be attributed to the ideology of Black consciousness. It was the influence of Black consciousness ideology that made the uprising possible, that made students protest against the use of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction. Right, let me briefly go to the Soweto uprising. When I explain the Soweto uprising, we are saying we are attributing this to the Black consciousness ideology, because learners were infused with the Black consciousness, and also because some of the teachers who were coming from university, they were also infused with Black consciousness ideology from SASO. They now got together and still proceed with the same way of thinking while it's in school. So it was now a combination. Learners have been infused through South African Student Movement, and also teachers coming from university, they have been infused through SASO. So now they had come together, and there was what was called the formation of this SASO and SASM, South African students, the SASO and SASM. They influenced the formation of what was termed the Soweto. They influenced the formation of the Soweto students. Representative Council. This was a council what was put in place to try and uphold the demands of students in Soweto. A council which was going to represent the demands or what the students in Soweto were looking forward to be fulfilled on their behalf. So what happened was through the Bantu education system, which I've mentioned earlier on, the white regime was adopting a Bantu education system, which was unfair for the Black men. The Blacks were supposed to do practical subjects in high school. They were not mandated to attempt those science subjects, those high-paying subjects like the engineering subject. They would not have an opportunity to do that, but rather they were meant to do agriculture, they were meant to do woodwork, they were meant to do metal work. Those are forms of educational practices which would train them for the workplace and not to emancipate themselves to become self-reliant, but rather to work for them, white men. So they were not happy with the Bantu education system. What did they do? On top of them implementing the Bantu education system on the Black men, they also instituted what was called the Circular 50/50, which was issued by the Department of Education. This Circular 50/50, what was the implication of Circular 50/50? On top of Bantu education, the Blacks were denied the right to attend good education, to attend good and well-paying subjects in the future. On top of that, there was a circular which was put in place, which was the circular 50-50, which instituted that Afrikaans was supposed to be the medium of instruction. What we are saying here, we are saying Afrikaans was supposed to be the language of teaching and learning. That is what it means when I say it's a medium of instruction. We are saying for teaching and learning to take place in the schools, they were supposed to teach in Afrikaans, they were supposed to learn Afrikaans. That was our circular 50-50, which was issued by the Department of Education, instituting that schools were supposed to teach in Afrikaans. And because of the infusion of Black consciousness ideology, Afrikaans, whose language is it? Remember, the indigenous people had got their own languages. There is isiZulu, there is Setswana, there is Xhosa, there's all those African languages. But now they are saying we should learn in Afrikaans. This was regarded as the language of the oppressor. So there was need to resist the institution of the language of the oppressor as the medium of instruction. So the learners, they took it to their own discretion to go and demonstrate against the secular 50-50. And the police reacted violently. The innocent learners who were demonstrating against the issuance of secular 50-50. That was on the 16th of June, 1976, where we realized the Soweto uprising, and there still remains a popular memory of the Hector Peterson, the 13-year-old boy, which most of us, we don't want to be reminded of, because it's a very pity sight of a very innocent boy dying in such a tragedy because of the recklessness of a regime that is forcing to use a language of their own on the learning process of African learners. Right. That is basically how we can point out on the influence of Black consciousness ideology on the students. Right. Then I'm going to look quickly on the influence of Black consciousness on starting community projects, community programs. Influence of Black consciousness on starting community programs. Right, this one is mainly based on the self-reliance. We are saying with Black consciousness ideology, Black people were supposed to be self-reliant. They were supposed not to rely on the white men. They were not supposed to rely on everything from the white men, but rather they were supposed to find ways of their own survival. So through Black consciousness ideology, the Black people got to emancipate themselves through our community programs. Right. We know that Steve Biko was banished from King Williamstown. They did not allow him to be in King William than good for the people of King William, so they banished him from visiting King Williams. But the attention to community projects, they started doing self-reliant, self-sustaining their own as a society in different sections where they are used to stay, which was promoting independence from the whites. They were trying to liberate themselves from the white reliance. They were not now relying on the white person for employment, but rather they were coming out with their own project for survival. Right? We can also highlight some of the projects that were put in place. And also remember, the white government was adopting a policy of separate development. They did not want to develop areas which were dominated by the blacks. So blacks had to develop their own areas. They had to come out with strategies of providing themselves for infrastructure, providing themselves the basic infrastructure required for a viability of their societies, and also come out with projects which will sustain their lives economically. So instead of them relying on the government, they were now advocating for a project for self-sustenance, which will make them self-reliant and not rely on the white men. Right. We can give examples here. There was the Sanempilo health clinic. I'll just highlight some of the examples. You can also talk of the Ginsberg Educational Trust. Or we can also talk of the Ituseng Community Health Program. In as much as we cannot exhaust, but the implication here was that Black people were trying to come out with their own way of running their own societies. They were trying to come out with a way of liberating themselves and not rely on the government, because the government did not want or would not target to develop their areas. So they were now trying to develop their own areas by coming out with initiatives to further and develop their own areas. And also they instituted the winter school projects, trying to assist learners through the winter schools, because the government did not want to fund for such a project. So the Black people had to fund for themselves, fund for their own children's education, and try to make them achieve. So that was a way of emancipating and trying to do away with the issue of white man's domination. And then lastly, because we cannot exhaust everything, we can also look at influence on workers. The Black consciousness also tried to influence our workers. We have talked about unions and also on workers on their own, right? What was being done to workers? Remember, we're talking of self-reliance here. Instead of people resorting on to working for the white men, they were supposed to be self-reliant, and also they were supposed to change their mentality at workplace. Instead of them feeling self-pity and being abused by the whites, they were supposed to realize themselves as worth and also try to challenge even in the workplace. So what did they do? They mobilized the workers to form trade unions. Through Black consciousness ideology, trade unions were formed. And we can talk of the Black Allied Workers Union. It was one of the renowned unions in South Africa that started demonstrations against the white regime. In 1973 in Durban, there was a widespread industrial action which is renowned in the history of South Africa, which was started through the Black Allied Workers Union, which came as a result of the ideologies of Black consciousness. So that is the picture of Black consciousness ideology towards challenging the apartheid state, towards the changing of mentality to liberate liberate Black people from the mentality of self-pity, inferiority complex, and all that, to try and emancipate Black people from that way of thinking, and such that they will be able to come to a position where they will challenge the apartheid government. So, in as much as we have discussed, we cannot exhaust everything. We now need to go to the conclusion of our essay. Right, when we are concluding, we are tying up our points. Given that we have discussed a lot of aspects in this essay, we can tie up our discussion by highlighting maybe the key points, or by giving the reader a conclusive statement of what they were going through in the discussion, or by highlighting what we think is the key element in the discussion, and without actually repeating or describing the same way we described it in the presentation, because that will be repetition. Or we cannot introduce a new thing in the conclusion. We just need to tie up our discussion in the most possible and most convenient way of summing up our discussion. Right, what you can do in this, you can say, from the discussion above, one can undoubtedly agree that it was the belief of Black consciousness movement that Black people should liberate themselves from psychological and be self-reliant in the struggle to challenge apartheid government in the 1970s. The psychological liberty and the relief that Black people have today cannot be celebrated without giving credit to the ideas of Steve Bantu Biko. I think that is a sound conclusion which is contextualized. Our conclusion is addressing what we adopted in the line of argument, and also is tying up our points by giving us that in as much as we are celebrating the liberty that we have now, the mindset that we are having now, we cannot talk of this new mindset that we have without talking of the ideas that were infused by Steve Biko. Because if it was not for the ideologies of Black consciousness, we will still be having the self-pity ideology. we will still be having the ideology of rejecting ourselves and not realizing our self-worth. We will still be having to rely on the white men and not have any self-reliance. So we can be rest assured that the ideologies of Black consciousness, they assisted so much in the transformation of the Black people towards their self-realization and towards whatever is now currently being experienced, which is beneficial for the Black men. So we give credit to the ideas of Steve, Bantu, Biko. Basically, that is the essay, right? I'll quickly take you through a discussion for question number 5. But in as much as we are discussing question number 5, we cannot dwell much on some of the concepts. We just want to highlight what you need to know so that you are able to answer that question. Given now that the structure of the essay, you know what you are supposed to follow. You are supposed to follow P, you are supposed to have an introduction and the structure of the essay. Now you are familiar with the structure of the essay. We cannot still go back to that aspect of us addressing the structure of the essay, but rather we need to go to the points that will help us answer the essay question. Right, we know that the question number 5 is the road to democracy. The essay question is basically based on the transition from the rule of the white government to a democratic South Africa, which was realized in 1994. What happened for us to realize the transition that happened? What was done by the South African movement to try and come out with a new South Africa, which is independent, which is democratic now, where there is democracy, given that we were exposed to the harsh treatments of apartheid, and also we were treated badly through segregatory practices that were put in place by the apartheid regime. So the question is basically based on the process of negotiations that took place and the disturbances that happened as the negotiation progressed. Because remember, the negotiations did not progress smoothly. They were marred with some incidents of violence and also some frustrations amongst the participants who were supposed to come out on to come to the discussion table. So we're going to look at the question and try to identify the valid points that we can use for that particular essay for us to be able to come out with a valid response that will answer that particular question. Right. That is basically what we want to look at in our discussion to come just like now. Right. Let me go to the question. Right. The question is saying the road to democracy was characterized by the continuous emergence of violence and conflicts that failed to stop the first democratic elections in South Africa in 1994. So we are saying it was a road, meaning to say it was a transition. When you are on the road, you are moving. We are coming from apartheid to democracy. And what is happening as we are moving from apartheid to democracy along that road, we are having continuous emergence of violence and conflict. But what did those do? What did those two aspects do? What did the violence do and what did the conflict do to our road? Did we stop on the road because there was violence, or did we stop on the road because there was conflict? No, they failed to stop the first democratic election, which meant that despite the actions of violence and the instances of conflict, still the road progressed and we managed to get to the democratic South Africa, which was born in 1994. So the question says, critically discuss this statement. A critical discussion question, we need to approve the statement or we need to disapprove the statement. Are we saying that is a valid historical statement? In my view, that is a very valid historical discussion, a very historical statement, because there are instances of violence which happened, and there were conflicts that were realized as the process progressed, which means that I have to approve that particular statement. So I'll try to highlight how I can introduce my essay based on that particular question. I would introduce it like I will take the most simple stance of introducing this. The road to democracy was indeed characterized by the continuous emergence of violence and conflicts that failed to stop the first democratic elections in South Africa in 1994. The negotiation process involved events such as the Grootska Minute, the Pretoria Minute, the Convention for a Democratic South Africa 1 and 2, amongst other negotiation processes. Whilst these were taking place, several spats of violence and incidents of conflict were realized. This presentation will focus on the transition from apartheid to a democratic South Africa in 1994. Basically, that is how I can introduce this essay. Though it's not a pre-planned introduction, but I've tried to touch on the aspects. I've tried to adopt a line of argument. I have shown that that is a valid historical statement because I've approved it. And also, I've given some piece of historical evidence about the negotiations that were taking place. I've talked about the Grootska Minute, I've talked about the Pretoria Minute, I've talked about the CODESA 1 and CODESA 2. That is the road. Because on the road, we are having processes taking place. We reach bus stop A, we reach bus stop B as we are going towards our destination. So I've highlighted some of the events that took place on the road, which we are going to elaborate in the discussion. Then I've also indicated that whilst those were taking place, there were also spats of incidents of violence and spats of incidents of conflicts amongst the negotiators. As this process was happening, as we were on the road, people got to disagree, and we disagree to agree again. And people also got to fight along the way. And how is the discussion going to elaborate this? This is going to be based on the transition from apartheid to a democratic South Africa, which was realized in 1994. I think that is a complete introduction. It has all the aspects required of an introduction. Right. What we need to do with this essay, given that we need to have some brief background, what we can talk about here, I will highlight on some background before the negotiation process. What had happened before the negotiation process, and what then happened when negotiations started. Right, we can point it back to the history of Nelson Mandela as a prominent feature and as a prominent figure for the politics of South Africa and for the liberation of South Africa. We know that Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life in prison for planning to overthrow the apartheid government by violence in 1964. He was jailed during the spate of incidents of arrest when the government was suppressing resistance, and he was amongst the victims who were jailed. Remember the Lily's Farm incidents, whereby the ANC armed wing was sold out and was caught unprepared and unaware by the white regime, and were in possession of incriminating evidence with them, and they were sent to jail. So Nelson Mandela was also jailed in 1964. It was in prison by then. And we also know that around in 1985, the president then of the National Party, Botha, he offered Mandela a conditional release from prison on condition that he renounced the armed struggle of the ANC against the government. And what did he do? He refused flatly. He did not take the offer. Botha wanted to give an impression to the world that he has released the prominent figure of South African politics. He has released Nelson Mandela from prison, but he was giving the condition, was giving a conditional release that Nelson Mandela renounces the armed struggle. He would say, no, gentlemen, let's stop fighting against the white government. Let's be friendly to them, and so that I can be released. But he flatly refused. He chose to stay in prison for as long as he was alive. The struggle was supposed to continue. And what else do we need to note to this background here? We also need to note that in January 1989, the president, who was the P.W. Botha, he suffered a stroke. And in February, he announced his resignation as a leader of the ruling National Party, but he remained the president of the country. After he suffered a stroke, he chose to withdraw from being a leader of the party, but he still maintained his presidency, which means he was creating complications. How do you be a part of a leader of the nation when you are not the leader of the ruling party? And F.W. de Klerk, he replaced him as the leader of the National Party. And this created a unique situation of dual leadership that led to power struggle within the National Party. There was now the state president, and there was now a party president who is different from a state president. It created power wrangles, it created power problems, because what we discuss at party level should be implemented at national level, because the ruling party is the one which has got dominance over national decisions. So it was creating a confusion that when you are discussing party politics, you are having another leader. When you are discussing national politics, you have another leader. So it created power wrangles and confusion. And what later on happened, that was on August 14, 1989, Botha resigned as state president, and de Klerk was named the acting president until 20th September, when he was elected and sworn in as state president to a full 5-year term. That was the transition that happened. The transition from the rule of P.W. Botha, he got a stroke, he resigned from being a party president, he became the state president, but later on, his situation did not save him. He chose to resign again from the national politics. And he let the party president by then, who was de Klerk, lead the state. And also, in the coming general election, de Klerk was the one who was elected to lead South Africa for a full 5-year term. Then let's look at what happened, given that we now know that Botha had offered Mandela a conditional release, which was flatly rejected by Nelson Mandela. What did de Klerk do? Did he also follow the same trend, or did he also adopt the same leadership qualities which were being adopted by the previous president? Did he still maintain his hatred, or did he still maintain his segregatory practices for the blacks, given that he was a new president and given that he was sworn in after this one had tried to offer a conditional release to the father figure of South Africans? Now let's look at what happened after de Klerk became the president. Right. On 2 February 1990, in his opening speech to Parliament, President F.W. de Klerk began a new era of South African history. He declared that the season of violence is over. The time for reconciliation and reconstruction has arrived. You are seeing his perception now. It shows that he's someone who has got a different perception to the previous leader. He is talking of reconstruction, he's talking of reconciliation. He wants to bring people together. He has got that mentality of bringing blacks and whites to work together for the common goal, to reconstruct the economy. So at one go, what did he do? De Klerk announced that the government would unban all opposition political organizations. For example, the ANC was banned. The PAC was also banned. So they were supposed to be unbanned to show that he wanted to reconcile with everyone, and also he was targeting reconstruction of the country. He chose to release the ban on the political parties. The Pan-African Congress, the South African National Congress, the South African Communist Party was also banned. The ban was uplifted. He also talked of the release of all political prisoners who have not guilty of violent crimes, including Nelson Mandela was also supposed to be released. You are seeing his attempt now. He's trying to come out with a new ideology of for reconciliation. He also talked of suspending suspending executions. Those who were on the execution list were pardoned. They were suspended. And also the release of Nelson Mandela unconditionally. He chose to release Nelson Mandela from the prison without any condition, without any strings attached to his release. And this opened the way for a settled negotiation. Given now that the play field has been leveled, now we can start negotiating to find a new direction for South Africa. That's the road. Then what happened along the road? We need to analyze the series of events that happened. So I might not be able to elaborate much on them, but we need to give you a highlight of what events took place and the instances of disturbances and conflicts that were realized along the way. So in this instance, we'll be discussing the events and also be discussing the series of violence and the series of conflicts that were realized between the negotiating parties. And in this instance, much of the negotiation was taking place between the National Party government and the ANC representative. Right. Let's go to March 1990. That is in March 1990, what happened in March 1990? Right. Given that there was a ground for negotiated settlement, what happened? The police shot dead 11 demonstrators. Were shot by the police in the township of Sebokeng, near Joburg. In protest, Mandela postponed the first round of talks that had already been agreed between the ANC leaders and the government. Given that we are planning for a negotiated settlement between the government and the African liberators, now we are shooting Africans again. It shows that you are dishonest. Then Nelson Mandela chose to withdraw from the negotiations that were already scheduled for. And there were also other more militant figures on the NC side. We had one militant figure was Chris Hani. Chris Hani was the chief whip of the armed struggle, the armed wing of the Umkondo, the Sizwe. Right. What was the Umkondo Sizwe? The Umkondo Sizwe was apparently the armed struggle of the ANC, where they would strategize the armed liberation struggle. So this one was the chief of staff within the Umkondo Sizwe and was very militant. He did not want these things of negotiations. He wanted to continue with the liberation struggle. He wanted to keep fighting until the liberation was realized. He opposed immediately giving up the armed struggle. He chose to continue going to the playfield to fight, going to the battlefield to resist and keep fighting because this government has proved to be unfaithful. We are planning for negotiations and you are sending police to victimize and assassinate people without any valid reason. So they chose to go back to fight. So we are seeing the effect here that there is an advancement which has been put in place by the president. He's trying to come out with reconciliation. But along the way, there are instances of violence which are taking place. Police are shooting innocent civilians in Sebokeng. And at the same time, Nelson Mandela, who had chosen to go to the discussion table, is also withdrawing. This is a conflict. So are we seeing how we are addressing the question? We are talking of the road to democracy by indicating the procedure of negotiation which was put in place. And as the procedure is in place, there is an instance of violence. And the instance of violence is creating conflict amongst the parties to the negotiation table. Nelson Mandela has chose to withdraw from the negotiations. Chris Hani is saying, no, we should not cease the armed struggle. This is conflict. So that is how we address the question as the events unfold and as the events progress. And remember to link your statements, link to instances of violence, link to instances of conflict, link to the road as we proceed with the discussion. Then let's go to the 2nd of May. Right. What happened on the 2nd of May, 1990? Right. We're going to the 2nd of May, 1990. Right. On the 2nd of May, 1990, the two main sides of the National Party government and the ANC met officially for the first time and produced a document called the Groot Minute. That was the first meeting. The first meeting failed, which was planned because of the instance of violence in Sebokeng and the withdrawal of Nelson Mandela and the continued resistance by Chris Hani. So the second, the successful meeting that they had was on the 2nd of May, and they came out with a document which was called the Groot Minute. What was there in the Groot Minute? What did they discuss and what did they agree? Right. In this joint statement, the ANC agreed to reconsider the armed struggle, while the government agreed to create a climate for negotiations. The ANC now, they've chosen to reconsider the armed struggle, and the government is promising to create an environment conducive for negotiation. Right. What did they do? They agreed that they were supposed to allow exiles to return. Those activists who had gone out of the country for fear of their lives, they were supposed to return, and also release political prisoners, and also remove oppressive laws and lifting of the state of emergency. Right. But however, what did the ANC do? The ANC, however, decided to continue with a secret operation called Operation Vula. Given now that they had known the behavior of these guys are unfaithful. We are trying to come out the negotiation table. They are sending police to cause violence. So what should we do? Should we relax completely and rely on them? Should we have full faith on them? No, let's have a separate and private arrangement in case if they behave the other way around. After we have disbanded our armies, after we have decided to leave the battlefield completely, what are we going to do? So what happened? A group that directed armed activists within South Africa, the idea was to provide an insurance policy in case of negotiations failed. We need insurance. If negotiations fail, what are we going to do? We need to go back to the battlefield. So we should be having an indirect fighting front on the field. Fact that in case negotiations fail, we go back to the old way of coming to terms. Then in July 1990, the police arrested top leaders of Operation Vula, who was notably Mark Maharaj, was one of the major leaders of the Operation Vula, claiming that they were planning to seize power from government by means of armed uprising. That was the proclamation of the government. And charges against the leaders of Operation Vula were eventually dropped, and these jailed members were released. Because we were going for a negotiation table, now we are arresting some of our members again. Then should we go to negotiations if you don't release them? Release them so that we can continue with the negotiations. Right. Then we go to August 1990. Right. That was in May 1990. Let's go to August. What happened in August 1990? Right. The ANC government met again, and this time they produced what was called the Pretoria Minutes. That was the document which was drafted after the negotiated settlement here. In terms of this agreement, de Klerk government promised to release all political prisoners, indemnify returning exiles from prosecution for political offenses, and in return, ANC agreed to suspend armed struggle with immediate effect, which was an act of good faith to show commitment to peace negotiations. The National Party also agreed to suspend state of emergency, which was a compromise by both the role players. So we are seeing in this instance here, the both players have compromised. The government has promised to release political prisoners, to indemnify returning exiles. What we call indemnification, we are saying those returning political prisoners, they were not supposed to go through a criminal court and be prosecuted for the offenses that they committed. They were supposed just to come as free men, as free women, and join the rest of the South African society without any challenges. And also, the ANC in good faith agreed to suspend the armed struggle. Given that they had Operation Vula, they now agreed that no, we are now seizing Operation Vula, which was an act of good faith. They were acting in the belief that we wanted now to negotiate and take the country to another level. We need to move to democracy. Then what happened after that? There was also an accord which we also need to note. There was a National Peace Accord which was signed by 27 political organizations. Among us, the active South African organizations, they came together to sign a National Peace Accord to guarantee that there was going to be peace in South Africa. Violent events were supposed to be seized. Political parties were not supposed to still uphold the armed struggle. They were supposed to seize. They were supposed to seize the gunfire and resort to negotiation process. So they signed what was called the National Peace Accord. It's also one of the very most important events that happened through the negotiation process. The National Peace Accord, which was signed by 27 political organizations. Right. Which is also termed the Goldstone Commission. Right. Then we go to the to 20 December 1991. Right. 20 December 1991, what happened on the 20th of December 1991? Right, there was what was called the CODESA 1. The CODESA here, which is an acronym for a convention for a democratic South Africa, which meant that it was a convention, a gathering, decide on the coming of democracy for South Africa, convention for a democratic South Africa. That was CODESA 1. What was agreed on CODESA 1, on who was involved in that particular event? 19 political parties, except the Conservative Party and Pan-African Congress. They got to that CODESA. The parties could not agree on power sharing and constituent assembly. The meeting ended. Given that there were so many participants for that CODESA, for that convention, they could not reach a common consensus because each one would be pulling on their side. So they could not reach a common agreement for CODESA 1. And the meeting had to end without them reaching a consensus, without them reaching a common agreement on how they were supposed to share power, given that there were so many active political parties which were against apartheid. And also, given that the apartheid regime was not faithful and did not want to seize power instantly. So the CODESA 1, the meeting just ended without anything that was finalized because they disagreed on power sharing and could not ascertain the Constituent Assembly. Right. Then there was the Declaration of Intent. It's also another event which happened along the road. The Declaration of Intent. Right, what happened on the Declaration of Intent? The parties, they agreed to draw up a new constitution and interim government. They agreed that there was supposed to be a new constitution governing the country. Instead of us following the national party government, let's adopt a new constitution which is going to be used to govern the country. And also to adopt an interim government, a transitional government which was going to act as we wait to finish the negotiation process and come out with a democratically elected government. Right. Then also there was, this is one of the events, there was a referendum, the whites referendum. Whites only referendum. Right, in a referendum, what happens is people vote. It's a vote yes or no towards a particular event to happen. Should we continue with negotiations? A question to the whites. Yes or no, should we keep negotiating with these black political parties? It was a whites-only referendum, a decisive referendum, which was only for the whites to test the feel of the whites. How were they reacting to the negotiation process? Were they happy? Or were they frustrated with the process? Did they want to seize power to the blacks? Or did they want to have a power sharing deal with the blacks? So what happened? De Klerk tested white opinion after losing 3 by-elections to the Conservative Party. He was losing to the other white party. The by-elections, we are saying we're feeding in new parliamentarians after maybe there is one parliamentarian who has been dismissed from parliament or who has died. We need to do a by-election. So those by-elections were coming now in the favor of the Communist Party. So de Klerk wanted to test if the white people were still loyal to him. And he wanted to test, you have a feel of how they were reacting to his rule. So he did the whites-only referendum. And what was the result? The result was a landslide yes. The whites, they agreed that, no, let's go to the negotiation table. We are tired of this apartheid thing. We are tired of being made the West people on earth because of the segregatory practices. So they said yes. And negotiations continued because they voted yes for the referendum. They said negotiations should continue. Then what was supposed to happen? After the referendum, there was now CODESA 2. Given that the first CODESA failed, there was now a new convention for a democratic South Africa, which was CODESA 2, right, which happened on the 2nd of May. That was in 1992. What happened during this CODESA? Now they have come to the discussion table. They want to finalize issues regarding the democracy of the country. Right, the CODESA 2 did not last because of violence and inability of parties to agree on power sharing. Again, you are seeing the incoming of violence to the negotiation process. We are trying to come out of the negotiation table to get to terms, but still instances of violence are still being realized and are still disturbing the negotiation process. What happened? What instance of violence happened which disturbed the CODESA 2? There is what is called the boy. Boy Patong massacre. Right, the Boy Patong massacre, what was it about? It was an influence of a third party, a third force. What we're calling a third force here, we're saying it's any force which is not ANC or the National Party. Any external force outside the negotiation process which is coming to interfere with the negotiation process. That was a third force. Right. The Baipatong massacre, what happened? It happened on the 17th June. Um, 1992. People have chose to gather on the 2nd of May, while they are still negotiating and they haven't reached the conclusion. On the 17th of June, there is violence. Right, what happened in this incident here? The Jos Law for Informal Settlement in Boipatong, outside Fernaken, was attacked by a group of about 300 armed men from Pamadala Hostel in nearby Sebokeng. These guys who attacked the Boipatong, who caused this massacre, they were affiliated to the Inkatha Freedom Party. Why we're saying the third party, they were affiliating to the Inkatha Freedom Party. They were not from the ANC or from the National Party. They were not sent by the government. They were not sent by the ANC, but they were affiliating to another different organization, which was the Inkatha Freedom Party. And what was their motive? Why did they cause this massacre during the negotiation process? Right, the observers who witnessed this, they suspected that the attack was aimed to undermine the negotiation between ANC and the National Party. They wanted to disturb the negotiations that were taking place. They were not happy with the negotiation. They didn't want the realization of results from the negotiation process of CODESA 2. So they chose to disturb it by causing a massacre. And what happened to that? Now we're talking of violence disturbing the negotiation process. And what happened to that? What was the reaction? ANC withdrew from negotiations. The ANC was blaming the National Party for the attacks. Given that the ANC was not very sure of the sincerity of the government in negotiation, they thought maybe the government wanted to make them think that it's a third party, while it's the third force, while it is sponsored by the government to disturb the negotiation process. And again, on the 7th of September, there was the other instance of violence which also happened, which is termed the Bisho massacre. The Bisho massacre happened on the 7th of September. That was 1992. What was this again? It's another spate of violence which is disturbing the negotiation process. ANC was withdrawn because there's this Sebokeng incident, the Baipatong massacre. Now there's the Bisho massacre again. When did it happen? What happened on that particular event? Right. This Bisho here was the then nominally independent homeland of Ciskei in the Eastern Cape. Those homelands where Black people were supposed to stay. So there was an incident of violence which happened in the Bisho homeland of Ciskei in the Eastern Cape. Who was massacred and what happened? Right. We are told that 28 ANC supporters and one soldier were shot dead by the Ciskei Defense Force during a protest when they attempted to enter the Bisho, demanding the incorporation of Ciskei into South Africa during the final years of apartheid. They wanted to incorporate the homeland to the South African Republic, because remember, the government was adopting a policy of homelands being independent on their own. They were made to decide on their affairs. So they were not happy with the fact that they were discriminating the homelands and making them depend on their own, yet they did not have any form of sustaining funding. So they were demonstrating against that. They wanted the homeland to be incorporated back to the South African Republic. But however, the reaction by the forces, they shot and killed 28 ANC supporters in the instance, which also disturbed the ongoing negotiation process. And what was the reaction again by ANC? Right. We are also told that ANC are called for rolling mass action. This is a source of conflict. They are influencing people to do widespread demonstrations. They are influencing people to go astray and try to they were influencing now people to go around doing mass demonstrations and demonstrating against the government. They were now trying to go back to the defiance campaign incidents. They were trying to use those strategies of influencing people to do widespread demonstrations. So in Joburg, about 25,000 people marched against the racial segregation. And as a result, this sustained resistance imposed pressure on the government. They wanted now the government to succumb to pressure. They were now pushing the government to compromise. They wanted the government to accept some of what they were suggesting in the discussions, in the negotiations. They wanted now to force the government to accept some of those prescriptions that they were pushing for. Then let's go to the record of understanding of 26 September 1992. The record of understanding that was on 26 September 1992. Right, what was it? This record of understanding was an agreement which was put in place by Mayor and Ramaphosa. They committed themselves to peace and to negotiations and agreed on the Jaws Law of Sunset Clause. They wanted the parties to resume negotiations by them being representatives of the ANC and the National Party. They came to agree on each other so that they would settle down and try to have peace on the ground and also try to make the negotiation process go ahead. Who was Mr. Rolf Meyer? Mr. Rolf Meyer was the Minister of Constitutional Development on the side of the National Party. And Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, who is now the current president of South Africa, was by then the Secretary General for ANC. Those two were the ones who came to the discussion table. They discussed and they got to settle with each other and came out with a record of understanding, which meant that they drafted a document which showed that they agreed with each other so that there would be peace and so that negotiations have to be resumed and to go ahead. Right. And what also was the setup was that parties which were winning more than 5% of the vote will form a government of national unity to govern the new South Africa, and whites would retain their jobs. That was one of the prescriptions that were set. As they were negotiating, they came to an agreement that if a party wins 5%, gets 5% of the vote, is going to constitute part of the government that is going to rule the country. And right, let's go to the multi-party negotiations, which resumed at the World Trade Center. Right, there was a multi-party negotiation event which resumed. Multi-party negotiations, which means there were so many parties involved in these negotiations, and they were happening at the World Trade Center. How did they go? Did they proceed? They did not last. Why didn't they last? There was this right wing, the AWB, which was the Afrikaner right wing. What to call the right wing, we are looking at those who use the militant approach to solve problems. They don't rely on negotiations. They don't want negotiations. They rely on violence. They resort to violent ways of solving problems. So this right wing, which was affiliating to the Afrikaner, they came to disturb that negotiation process. That was on the 25th of June, 1993. What did they do? They came with an armored vehicle to the World Trade Center. An armored vehicle, we're looking at those army vehicles which are bulletproof, those are resistant those hardened resistant armored vehicles which are used for the war. So what they would do was they stormed the World Trade Center with an armored vehicle. They crashed through the window, the front window, the discussion building, and they took over the negotiation chamber. So which meant there was no more negotiation. There are armored people who have come to the venue. They've come violently. They did not use the formal channel of getting into the venue. They even smashed the walls and got into the venue with their armored vehicle, which is showing an impression of a violent attack on the negotiation process. So the negotiation process did not go. It's an incident of violence and a disturbance along the way, the negotiation process. Then also let's go quickly to look at what happened to Chris Hani. We've talked about Chris Hani, who was the militant, who was part of the, was a chief in the armed wing of the NC Omkondo Esizwe. Right, Chris Hani was assassinated. That was on the 10th of April in 1993. Right, 10th of April 1993, South Africa lost one of its prominent heroes in the name of Chris Hani, who was assassinated. It is also assumed that he was assassinated by the right wing, who was a Polish immigrant who was called Janusz Wallace. Right, that was on the 10th of April, 10 April 1993. That was when Chris Hani was assassinated. He was assassinated at his home in Don Park. That is in Boksburg. He was just assassinated out of his car at his house in Boksburg, in Don Park. And the guy who was behind the assassination was from Poland. He was a Polish immigrant who was called Janusz Wallace. He was the man behind. And unfortunately, Chris Hani did not survive the assassination. He died on the spot. And what was the reason for this guy, who was part of the right wing, to assassinate the militant Chris Hani? The reason was to plunge the country into a state of chaos, which would allow the right wing to take over. They did not want the negotiation process to happen the way it was going. They wanted the right wing to take over the control of the process and to take over ultimate control of whatever was happening. So they chose to disturb the process by assassinating the prominent figure in the name of Chris Hani. So that was the the incident that happened. Then after that, Mandela had to address the nation on TV, calming the nation because the country was now in a state of panic. People were now afraid of the events that were happening in terms of violence. And the negotiation process was being delayed. So Nelson Mandela, being a father figure and being a prominent liberation figure, had to go on TV and address the state on calming the nation. Then there was also another incident of violence on the 25th of July 1993, which is